Welcome, everyone, to the first episode of a new series brought to you by Get the Mic, where your host on the right, Brock,
And your host on the left, Owl.
will be dissecting movies for their mythological and archetypal significance. Today, I am very excited to talk to Al about Spider Man No Way Home. It was something that sort of gripped everybody as sort of a cultural movement, it seems, right? The critics' consensus and the audience score came together to paint a picture that this is something that people really wanted to see, that they wanted to put their money into. It dominated the box office, and I think that it was pretty well written, actually, with the plot holes and criticisms taken seriously. I still think that it is a well constructed Spider-Man film. Um, Enough so that I think it's worthy of talking about, and I think it's worth kicking off this new series.
Yeah, I mean, this was kind of our idea all along to do myth and movies and start dissecting movies. We were gonna do some older catalog things, like stuff that we've liked. Brock mentioned The Matrix several times, but
Hmm.
I think it's prescient to speak about the subject at the time. And at the time, it actually happened that a good movie released, which is rare. So it may not happen that we do these so up to date every time, but I mean, for our first one, let's say it's a
I
good
would say
idea.
this is a good on ramp too, just to talk about these sort of ideas and how they come about in popular media, and maybe why it is that people resonate with it so much, right?
Yeah, and I mean, it really solidifies Spider-Man in the big three still
Hmm.
because after the Avengers, right? Like some not so popular fictional characters became very, very popular. Iron Man, for example.
So, yeah, it's very exciting to be able to talk about it while it's still relevant as to
Exciting.
why it is that people want to see this. Especially reflected against the Matrix, right? the the other end of the spectrum. Whenever there isn't the right type of reverence towards the source material and towards the things that gave it that spark originally, so that it resonated with people, right?
So should I go ahead and turn on those clips, eh?
Let's just jump into it, I guess.
Sure. A little other housekeeping that we do need to take care of, right? This is going to replace our upload of Dragon Ball for this week. It won't always do that. Like we will still sometimes release episodes on Sunday with Dragon Ball, but if we have a myth and movies that we can't live stream, because we do want to live stream these as well in the future. Um,
Right.
this is probably going to be our live stream format is going to be myth and movies, whereas our recorded format will be Dragon Ball.
Right. And that really is so that we can shape our content to be a regular upload, and at the same time go live and say something that doesn't disrupt the flow of the conversation, because as you know, and Get the Mic, a lot of what we have to talk about relies upon the last thing that was said. It would be really great in the future, we're working on our format right now, to be able to bring this as a live sort of conversation and see if we can spark a little bit of debate about what things might symbolically represent, that sort of thing.
All right, well, let's go ahead and get into it. So, uh, for we obviously don't have access to the full movie, so for this, we've used clips from the trailer, to play while we speak about it. And I think Brock has some notes to go over.
Not as much notes. I've got a summary of it pulled up, and I know the parts of it that I think are worth discussing, um, as far as why this is
Well,
more holy
refresh me
art, right?
too. Too at the end of Far From Home.
Hmm.
What happens at the very end of Far From Home?
The very end of Far From Home is essentially Quentin Beck hijacking all of the Stark drones and doing a terrorist attack, essentially, and Spider Man taking the blame for that and him outing Peter Parker as being Spider
Spider Man.
Man.
Okay,
And
yeah,
so
that's right.
then we get the nice little stinger reveal that J.K. Simmons is coming back, which is sort of our hint that a movie like this was going to come about in the first place, right?
So I think even before we speak about what's happening in this movie, we kind of need to talk about how it is that Mysterio is the one that reveals the identity of Spider-Man.
So that was what I wanted to talk about too. So the first
Because that's
sort of
I don't
topic
even
that
know if
I
that's up here
right,
yet.
right. I didn't really put this in the notes, but the first thing that I wanted to talk about was just the foundation of what this movie is and what it's the story that it's a continuation of, right? So that we get a little bit more context as to how this can be a good resolution and introduction to Spider-Man, right? And so the the situation and how it tied up in the last uh I would say in the last film where we've got the glasses in play that were given foolishly to Mysterio, right? I'm curious to see what your analysis of that is, what it would mean that originally um that Peter was doing that he was giving the glasses to Mysterio.
Well, first, I think we
And if you
should.
think it's tied into that abdication of responsibility.
It is, but first we need to establish right where those came from.
Sure.
Those were Stark. The glasses were from Stark Industries, right? At this point, Tony Stark is dead. This is after Endgame, and so the glasses are the things that control the drones. Now, Peter was really left with all this because Tony was kind of a father figure to him. Now, Peter did not create Mysterio as an antagonist or an adversarial spirit. It was Tony that did that. And how we come about to the reveal of Spider-Man's identity is that it is the flaws of the father reveal right those weaknesses in ourselves.
Right.
It's that nakedness of the father almost, and so his ability to and I like how they're glasses too because
Well,
that
because
allows
I
you to see, right?
it's like he's giving up his sight of his father's perspective, right?
Right. And so that and him giving it up too is
Mhm.
another part of it, and it's not just the abdication of responsibility, but kind of the rejection of the mantle, that spirit of the father, right? And so by doing so, he makes a mistake such that and that's what I think Mysterio is. He's not a spirit of the Father as such. He is a consequence of that, and by being a consequence of that, he brings out the flaws with Peter and reveals his identity in doing so.
Well, I think that it's a really good representation of it as well because of the reflection it has with Iron Man and Tony Stark's identity being public, right? And so it's almost to say you don't understand the responsibility that you've handed over to somebody to control, and so we're going to put you in Tony Stark's shoes now. You need to actually handle the responsibility that that the father actually that
Hmm.
your father figure handled, right? And so he steps into that world through his experience with Mysterio, right?
You're right, and it's because Tony did that
Mhm.
to Mysterio. Let's say that
But
is
yeah, I would like to say that it's Peter is inheriting that situation, right, from his technological father.
not even technological. I think spiritual as well. He has no other father figure
Well,
at all.
spiritual also in this sense
Yeah,
because now he has
definitely.
sacrificed himself for the
Well,
world.
and the vision too, right? And it is the vision that reveals it's that the glasses that eventually end up revealing Peter, right?
Mhm.
And so, yeah, I think all of that we have to kind of cover as a basis before we even get into this movie.
True, true, yeah. And it's a great setup for the symbols of what we're going to see and how those symbols manifest
And
themselves
how Peter will
in
grow from here, right?
well, specifically also just getting into the frame of thinking about the glasses like that, right? Putting them in the proper perspective, we can start to contextualize how those things are going to happen throughout No Way Home as well.
Yes.
So, with that said, I think we can jump into the main plot here, starting into the movie No Way Home. So, I've got a synopsis that I've just pulled up, condensed from IMDb, and we're going to scrub through it and talk about things as we get to them, as we think that they're relevant to the real meaning, the meat under the surface with this film.
Also, I do want to mention Spider-Man's identity, which is it being a secret, is more paramount to his character than Iron Man to his, let's say.
Right.
Um, and the reasons I think will become more apparent as we get through this film. in particular, because
Hmm.
Peter is not the spirit of the Father, and therefore cannot be instantiated in the world in the same way.
Right.
And so that's kind of, I just wanted to mention that before we continue.
Right, and that's going to line up with what he needs to do to change and how he actually progresses as a character in this movie, which is what I think everyone loves, right? That we're actually seeing some progress and it's not you know, an iteration of the same story, but it's continuing and it feels like it has a direction. Um so I think that's a good way to step into the plot of this one. So it's basically set immediately after the last film ended, and we see a nice scene where everyone's freaking out and pointing and yelling at Spider-Man. One person says, "You're just a kid," which is a reference to before, whenever they had said that whenever Tobey Maguire was on the train, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so he's basically forced to grab MJ and fly and get out of there. And so it essentially does a nice long sequence here at the beginning. So, 1 week after Quentin Beck's attacks in Europe and subsequent framing of Spider Man for his murder, Spider Man's civilian identity as Peter Parker is revealed to the world by J.K. Simmons. I want to note that he's Alex Jones in this film,
Yes.
explicitly,
Explicitly Alex
up
Jones.
to a joke that I haven't seen anybody else even pick up happened, not even on EFAP,
Oh, but it's going to happen.
but it is hilarious. Um, I definitely want to address that when we get to it.
I'm definitely going to clip it out and put it on Twitter and send it to EFAP.
Oh yeah, no, it's great. So Parker and MJ flee to his apartment, reuniting with Aunt May and Happy. Now, the situation, the first little thing that I want to talk about here is we're introduced to the fact that Aunt May is breaking up with Happy, that they were dating, and she is now rejecting him. And that's whenever Peter comes running into the apartment, right? I wanted to talk to you about the position of Happy as trying to fill the role of a father figure for Peter, but not being sufficient.
I mean, he's not what I'm curious. He's not sufficient. I'm not sure. Well, what would you have to say about it?
Well, he can't fill Tony Stark's shoes, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's apparent.
But it's interesting in this film because he's got all of this different Stark technology that he's got in his apartment, and he's trying to play this like swagger attitude about himself, right? And I think that he was, originally being Tony Stark's right hand man. He's trying to be that figure, also in trying to date Aunt May, right? But we're
I see.
introduced to
Yes.
him in this
Okay.
film with him being rejected as a father figure in that sense. Now he's not saying like, Peter, I'm going to be your dad, but you know
No.
what I
Yeah.
mean. He's
Yeah.
trying to fulfill that sort of role as being, that for him. And so I just thought it was funny that what we're going to see about his character and how ultimately the theme of this film is that Peter needs to step beyond needing that father figure. Is introduced right away in this film, right? That the father figure that was trying to be there is like, no, like there's no space for you.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I think that's kind of what you were getting at. Is yeah, it's a foreshadowing of what needs to happen, but it's also yeah. I don't know. I don't have too much to say about Happy. He's kind of
Yeah, well, he's just comedic relief, right? But
no.
I
He's
like
not just comedic
the
relief,
the
but
movie plays him that way though.
it does. But I mean, he's
But he's the fool in a sense
insubstantial
in that
because
sense.
he is he.
Well, I mean, he plays as a fool. Like they kind of play him as a fool. Like there's lots of just
Mm.
jokes. Like for instance, later on, not to get too far ahead, but Matt Murdock tells him, "You're gonna need a good lawyer," and he's like
Right.
goofy. He's kind of goofy
Remember,
about
I've
like,
only seen this
"Ugh."
once.
It's
You've
always
seen it
joking.
twice,
Yeah.
so
Well, he
you
plays
know
a
what it is.
jokester throughout the Spider-Man films compared to how he was played in
Right.
Iron Man.
In Iron Man, he was pretty much a straight man,
Well, he
right?
was
Like
more competent,
definitely, yeah.
But anyway, I just kind of wanted to point that out because I thought in thinking about the movie, it really felt like it kind of symbolized that role for Peter is no longer as
But
relevant.
it's I'm curious. Okay, so what do you think it means then that Aunt May, which is kind of this ancestral motherly spirit, is
Mhm.
rejecting Happy as a paternal spirit? But what does that say?
Well, she wants Peter to have to take responsibility.
Is that what it is?
I think so because that's ultimately what she does for him in the film, right? In her way that I don't think tonally works, but The
Yeah.
push is that she needs Peter to stand up and take responsibility for fixing things instead of, you know, having, you know, essentially
Is that it though? Because I would think that Aunt May has
this Aunt
she
May.
yeah. No, I know this Aunt May. I mean that's what I'm saying. Like even
Because this
her,
Aunt May is trying to be Uncle Ben as well, but I don't want to get too far
but
into that.
not. I mean, I'm not even talking about that. I'm just talking about her. Why she's with Happy to begin with. What is it because? And I'm very unversed on the Tom Holland Spider-Man trilogy. I've seen Homecoming once.
I don't think there's like an explicit reason.
Oh, okay, okay.
Like it's
I'm
just a
just
thing that
curious.
happened between movies,
Okay,
basically, if I
right.
remember correctly. Like I think there was something in Far From Home that hinted at it, but I don't think that there was like an
Mm.
explicit like, oh, we're dating and we're a
Maybe I'd
thing.
have to rewatch it. But
But
anyways, go ahead.
but yeah, it's introduced that
Let's
they were
move on.
dating through this film with them breaking up, right? And so, as Peter comes back, then he's basically he gets to come back in because Peter comes in the window and he's like, oh, I think I should come in and protect, right? And so, but he's actually being sort of forced out of the apartment. So he comes back in and they have their little meeting. And basically, after that, the Department of Damage Control comes and storms the apartment, takes evidence, and starts interrogating everybody. Um, they have a meeting with Matt Murdock. He has a little cameo in the film where they're discussing the status of all of the essentially the pieces that are in play, right? So we've been shown that they confiscated the glasses and they have shut off essentially Peter's access to all that Stark technology because in a broad sweeping sort of gesture they show like the DOD or what do they call it, the
EDC,
DODC or
whatever.
whatever,
Yeah.
shows them taking trucks in there and taking Stark equipment, and they're confiscating things because of all the drones. And so we're kind of cutting Peter off from all of that power and now grounding him back down to sort of like his nakedness has been exposed, right? So all that the access to the power that his spiritual father had, left to him has now been separated by him being exposed the way that he is.
Right. Which happens as the disintegration is made apparent. And this happened with Bulma. As the disintegration of her identity transpired
Hmm.
because of her interactions with Goku, right? She was no longer able to use the capsules.
Because of her understanding of responsibility.
Right. And that's the same thing that happens here. Is
Right.
Peter has royally messed up so much that he has disintegrated his or, yeah, I would say disintegrated the barriers
So
in his
that's why
life.
I'd referred to him before as a technological father,
No,
because
I
he
definitely
is
understand
losing
that.
access
Mhm.
to that which that spirit generates, right?
Yes.
That potentiality, and so we'll see that manifest throughout the film as well. But that initially happens. They have their little meeting with Daredevil, and Daredevil also
Whoa,
tells.
spoiler.
So yeah, I guess we didn't mention at the beginning of this. This is full on spoilers. This is a breakdown of
One
the
little,
film.
two little,
If
three
you
little
didn't notice by
spoiler.
now, but so it's funny. They're playing real fast and loose in this film, right? With who they're going to drag into it, and it's a strange continuity thing to pull Daredevil. From what I understand, I haven't watched all of Daredevil. I've watched a little bit of it, but to pull him played by the same actor into this world is to imply that the events of Daredevil could possibly be in the universe of all of the MCU, right? Which obviously doesn't
I'm not sure
really
Sony
vibe.
really cares.
But at this
Sony's just
point,
doing their own thing,
they're
yeah.
all just playing fast and loose, and they're calling it multiverse. And in some sense, I kind of like it. I really enjoy the idea that it's like the spirit of the thing takes precedent over whether or not it has the internal consistency that it needs. And I think that this movie is a real monument to that. That if you get the spirit of the thing right, you can have your plot holes and inconsistencies.
Yes. You can have your eagles not fly to Mordor immediately,
Yeah.
right? just to cite another example. So, and just like how there's not actually that many plot holes in the King Piccolo arc. So, go ahead.
So Parker, MJ, and Leeds return to high school, but their university applications are rejected due to the recent controversy. So we're introduced to the real kink in Spider-Man's plans here, because this is a continuation of the situation that he set up in the last movie, right? Where at the beginning of Far From Home, he's approached by Nick Fury and they say, "We need your help." And he says no. And he says that he wants to live a normal student life and take a break from all of this craziness after what happened with the Avengers films, right?
You mean when he was erased from existence?
Yeah, all of that stuff. He has said, you know what? Nope, I want to stay here in my own paradise. I want things to be normal for me. I want to remain, innocent. I want to remain a kid, innocence. And so he's now having to face the consequences of that, right? There's a very interesting aspect to this film where that's the genie's wish, right? You say, I want things to return to normal. Like, I want to be a normal kid. And then all of
But
the
the
chaos,
consequences will never be the same.
there's a point where the flood reaches up to the borders of paradise, right? It's like the point is that you don't wait that long. And so Peter has not been able to keep that chaos at bay, right? And so his willfulness, though, to want
Wait,
to
we're
have
talking about
that
the wish
normal.
already, or
No. But I
Oh.
mean, that's an aspect of this film, though. But
yes,
because he's getting, in a sense, the situation that is, it's almost like he's wrestling with what he deserves, right? Or what, because there's a responsibility that comes with, with the power that he has and the things that he knows. And so as he is, and this is similar to the situations we see in great fiction like Dragon Ball, where that abdication of responsibility that comes with the power that you have then creates the negative influence on you. It creates its opposite that you have to wrestle with then. And that's what's sort of happening symbolically here with Peter. With now, he has a situation where he cannot have that normal student life, right? And we see he goes back to the high school originally, has to get let through a crowd of people who are shouting for him and basically disrupting his friends' lives as well, right? And yelling at them and sort of basically being a nuisance to everybody. And we see the funny integration of the Alex Jones subplot here whenever the coach, I can't remember his name, he's played by Hannibal Buress. He just completely, so he didn't go on the trip in Far From Home. So he wasn't there and he didn't know what the other faculty that was on that trip knew, which was essentially like, yeah, Spider-Man was trying to save everyone there, right? So he has bought into the Infowar style narrative here that it was all Peter Parker. So he's like, "We know what you did. We know what you did."
we know what you are.
It was cracking me up.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, he tries to go back to that normalcy, and he can't have it, right? And so we see that he goes out on the roof of the school to escape the school now. So the place that he wanted to go and have normal now he can't return to.
Well, and I also want to mention the university applications are kind of just the last straw.
Right.
There's all
It shows
the other
that
stuff.
it's permanent rather than just being a temporary problem that he has to get over.
Right, and as long as these people know that his identity and are close to him, then there'll always be issues, right?
Right.
And that's kind of to say, and I'm curious because it's not so much the hero's identity must remain a secret. Most of the time, it needs to be brought to fruition, right? But with Peter Parker, because that's, and I think it's great that this movie does this, is that it gets the identity part of it right. It puts proper importance on the identity aspect of Spider-Man.
Right.
And that being, right, that he has that separation in his life because he has to accept the responsibility that his powers give him, right? That he's gained through the radioactive spider, but also to be responsible for the people in his life.
It's
That's
it's
always been the
something that,
balance, and that's why, like, when he delivers pizzas in the second one, he's like doesn't make a lot of
well,
money,
it
and
is also the thing that's disrupted all of these Tom Holland Spider-Man films, right? And that's that he has integrated far too many people into the culpability of what he does. And they haven't really, like, they dealt with it a little bit in the last film, but not really until now. They haven't really. I mean, think back to Tobey Maguire, Spider-Man, and the lengths that he went to make sure that nobody knew and he wasn't having anyone involved. And
but you know, it's almost
as soon as he did, what happened? So there's this aspect of it that I felt like they weren't really respecting with this series. And I think that what's happening in this movie with them treating it the way that they are is them trying to set that essentially right.
but let's say this: why is it important? Because yeah, let's articulate this out. Why is it important for Spider-Man's identity to remain a secret?
Because if his identity were revealed, then he could not have that. He couldn't have a normal life. That like it, if his identity as Peter Parker was associated with all of the things that he was doing outside of his personal life,
It's
he could no
almost the
longer have that
inverse.
personal life.
It's almost the inverse of Superman, right?
Hmm.
Because Superman lives among mortals, right? That he's way stronger than, and he acts as if he is one of them to be one of them, right?
Right.
It's almost like Peter does that with with the suit and with Spider-Man, right? He's being a hero at that point, but when he's Peter Parker, he's not necessarily that. Is that what I'm trying to say?
Right. And the people who are friends with Peter Parker shouldn't suffer for the things the Spider-Man does. That's why you need to keep them separated, right?
Or the things that Spider-Man is blamed for, which is another aspect
Right.
of this, is that the narrative can always be what it is, even if it's not the truth. Now, if it was almost, and that's the thing, I'm trying to puzzle it out, because it would make sense for his identity to come to fruition, to kind of dispel, and that truth would dispel the misinformation of, let's say, the Alex Jones character.
Hmm. An aspect of how I interpret that, though, is that
Because think
you
about
could say
how,
the wrong truth about
like,
him is revealed.
the obfuscation, right, of
Yeah.
one's identity,
Hmm.
the unforthrightness of putting your being into the world without anonymity.
So what you're saying is this is
I
that.
don't know what I'm saying.
Well, I mean,
I'm
this
trying to
is
puzzle it
well,
out.
well, putting it in that frame, this is that inevitability, right? Because you can't ultimately do it, and so you try to hold the floodwaters at bay, right? And you try to keep all of the chaos out,
Well, is
but
that it? Is that it? Is that his burning on the pyre, like Gwen? Let's say that he's doing that even though he knows it's futile and it'll eventually collapse. And I mean, in many of the Spider-Man stories, I haven't seen Spider-Man
well, I guess this is a
2.
good point to also just point out that my familiarity with Spider-Man is mostly limited to movies and games. So I haven't watched the animated series. I haven't watched the older TV series and stuff like
But
that.
you've watched the movies,
But
all
I've
of them.
watched all of the movies, yeah.
But I mean, yeah, that
I haven't
it's
read the comics.
a big part of most, not most, but many of the arcs in Spider-Man. Like Venom tries to, in the animated series, tries to reveal his identity, right? And that's a big part of it. And so, is it that Peter is? I'm trying to puzzle out the mythological significance of the identity
Okay,
part.
well, there is one aspect of it that I want to point out that
Go
is my
ahead.
interpretation. And so we're going to dig deep here. What's the
That's
first thing that happens after Adam and Eve are eat of the fruit and realize the difference between good and evil?
they put on clothes.
Yes, they clothe themselves in animal skins, right?
Mm-hmm.
What are superheroes doing? But they become aware of the difference between good and evil, right? And they're revealed naked to themselves. And so
Which
they
is a
clothe
power,
themselves
right?
in animal skins
Yes.
that represent that sort of chaos that they've integrated whenever that happens.
Okay.
And so
But
Peter's
it's not
identity,
anonymous though.
right? It's not anonymity is not necessarily the same thing, right?
But the part of the superhero thing is anonymity,
Right. So it takes on that other dimension,
which I'm trying to puzzle out.
right?
So
But I think
let's hear.
but I think that part of it can say a little bit about how it's treated. Like the so to remain anonymous, right? To keep your personal life separate from the heroic deeds that you do, right? The what I would say is that
Ooh,
Peter is staving off, right? The inevitability of evil, which is, basically damage done to innocence for, that they have not deserved, right? So he's trying to retain that innocent view of the world by staving off that happening, by trying to keep his basically he's trying to disassociate himself from his actions, right? And in doing so is not accepting the more mature worldview that he's not wanting to step out into that
I
way of
kind of
thinking.
disagree. I think this actually, there's a reason why the big three are
Hmm.
all superheroes that keep their identities a secret. It's because it's an explanation, or not an explanation, but it's a progression. So thinking about C.S. Lewis writing about chivalry and chivalric times and how it was a moral progression from the times of Achilles and let's say barbarian heroes. I don't think
Oh,
he says barbarian heroes.
I'm on the same page as you
So
now because I see where you're going with
yeah,
this. Yeah,
and so it's an expansion of that
I hadn't
because
thought about it from the chivalric
right
perspective.
because
Yeah.
if you think about that spirit right, it is one that blends grace and kindness and
Right, and that a
compassion.
good deed is done for the sake of itself.
Yes, and
Yeah.
so it's a total detachment of the ego from the deed itself, which is even more holy than what we've had in our heroes before.
Hmm.
That's why they have to. Okay,
Okay.
I
Yeah.
wanted to
Okay.
puzzle it
Yeah.
out.
No, that
That's it
definitely
though. That's it.
that on a broad scale, right?
Yeah, because I was trying
The
to think,
anonymity is
and it's
that
even
thing.
more
Yeah.
because it's just I wanted to think of that concept and kind of wrap my head around it, but I think that's it exactly.
Well, that's what happens, and so what this movie's tying up, for instance, is Spider-Man 3, right?
Well, don't whoa,
Because
let's not get that far yet.
right, but
But it is, but
addressing that
it
has a
is.
lot to do with what's going on in Spider-Man 3 as well. But yeah, so I wanted to point that out though, the way that it's manifesting in this story and the way that Peter's treating his suit in this story is actually going to be very symbolic, right? And so that's really tied into where we're at so far, where
But
now he is.
it's the creation of the dissociative ego that he can absorb the
Mhm,
reward, right? Well, not absorb the reward, but kind of negate the reward of a good deed.
mhm.
Okay, let's continue with the summary.
Right. So yeah, they are trying to escape to the roof. Peter and MJ have a scene together, and they sort of discuss being able to go to college together and how great it would be, and they want to spend time together. And then Ned comes up, and we see that Ned has also had a hard time with it, and he wants to get away from everyone. And so he plays the he really plays the fool in this movie. So he's coming and disrupting their alone time and
Well,
all of
it's
that.
because his identity. It's again an
Yeah.
identity theme, right? His identity is associated with them, and so it's really like he's Spider-Man's friend, and actually the
His
fact.
identity is being tied to being Spider-Man's.
Yes, and the fact that Flash Thompson is going around doing that, that's why it irks him so much, and he comments on it. I
Yeah.
even picked this up on one viewing, like,
Yeah.
he's more annoyed by it than anyone else, I think, that Flash Thompson's going around saying he's, like, one of their friends and all that. He's kind of and I think Brock, you may relate to this. He's one that would, like, try and do anything to keep the friend group together as part of his identity. It would be essential to him to keep the people in the friend group.
Right. It's basically what he finds as being an expression of goodness for him is tied into him being connected to the goodness that Peter does.
That too, yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
so in that sense the fool does precede the hero. He's sort of like he's his fan in a sense. He's his friend and his fan at the same time. So it's interesting though. They Peter realizes,
So none of them get to college.
yeah.
Any of them.
So they discuss
They
wanting to
they
go to the same college, and so they can
well,
keep that circle together, right?
right, but they apply to all these colleges and none will accept.
Right. It is a situation where they all finally get their last letter, which conveniently is the place they all want to go the most, which was how it's played up anyway, which is they all want to go to MIT, right? And so
Yes.
they
Admit.
all open them together, and we see in this scene too that in this continuity of events, MJ is like miserable with her job, right? And the boss keeps coming out and yelling at her and is mixing up who she is and stuff. And that'll come back up later at the very end of the film.
Identity.
But so MJ is miserable in this in her work uniform, right? You could say. So where she's at, she's not happy, and they open all of their stuff together, and nobody gets accepted into MIT, and it's obviously because of Peter Parker's identity being revealed. And so, as they are real associates of him, as they're really
And
his
that's
friends,
because he's no longer dissociated from the deeds of Spider-Man,
right?
like we said. And so that destruction of order, because that's an orderly thing, is the separation, the boundary, has caused all of this chaos.
Right. And it's being destabilized, right? All of the to associate with what he represents, right? Then makes you, well, guilty by association. And so they don't get accepted in, and we get this Flash scene where Flash comes up and he's cheering about being able to make it in. And he's like, "You guys didn't get in?" And they're like, "Yeah, because we're actually associated with Spider-Man."
Right.
Because what we've seen also, a little passage of time has happened. Flash Thompson has written a book about how he
Being
is
friends with Spider-Man.
best friends with Spider-Man, and he's really the man in the chair and all this stuff, right? So he's trying to assume Ned's identity and profit off of it. And so we see an inversion here where the dishonesty doesn't matter, and he's the one that gets into MIT. And so it's that unfairness towards those that towards the innocent around Spider-Man, right? Whereas those who would profit off of the identity of Spider-Man for their own gain, dishonestly then end up with a reward as a result of this everything being thrown into imbalance from the end of the last movie. And so Peter's sitting there sad, looking up, and he sees a wizard light hanging on the wall, right? Because it's about Halloween at this time. And this, we kind of get a little bit of a time frame as to how long the events of this movie take place, right? Because by the time we get to the end of the film, we'll see that it's winter.
Grimace.
And so so he sees that it's Halloween, and the Halloween decorations need to get taken down, so Halloween's just passed. And so he sees the wizard and he thinks to himself, what if I could go and just undo the mistake and just make people unknow who I am, right? So he goes to Doctor Strange to ask him if there's anything that he can do to undo this for the sake of the people around him that were not involved, that were innocent to the deeds of Spider-Man, right? And Doctor Strange essentially says, "Yeah, I can make people forget." And so Peter says, "That sounds great. Let's go." They go down into the sanctum.
Wait, what about Wong's warning?
Well, Wong does warn that he's actually Sorcerer Supreme.
Yeah, we should talk about that.
So because Strange got blipped, right? He hasn't been there for 5 years. So due to a technicality, according to Strange, Wong became Sorcerer Supreme. And Wong has no patience for this. And he says, you shouldn't do it. And then begrudgingly says,
And
just
why
leave me out of
is it morally and let's say mythologically bankrupt to do this action?
Well, Peter hasn't earned it. He wants to have his cake and eat it too, right? He wants to be able to do what he did in the last film, right?
Well, I mean, think about what villains do when they have access to wishes and things, right? They do something that's, well, they don't always do this. So maybe I shouldn't even mention it, but what I was thinking is that Peter's um selfishness in his desire, right? Because he maybe it's not selfishness. What am I trying to say? So when Peter makes his wish, right, and
Hmm.
he's unaware of the
He says that it's
consequences of,
selfless.
he does say that it's selfless, but it's also interfering with his own life, right?
Sure, there is a selfish aspect to it. Well, let's break out what that would mean, right? Because if this was a purely selfless spell, then it would be reasonable for him to agree to
For
exclude himself,
everyone.
right? To exclude the self
For
if it
ev
was selfless,
Right, for
right?
everyone to be. But that's when it comes in, is whenever he starts to have those,
The self comes back in, the
right.
ego comes back in,
And he's
right?
like, I don't want to
Or
completely dissociate,
yeah,
right? It's like you have to, or else the heroic spirit will be damaged. And
right,
that's what's happened in the beginning of this movie, is the heroic spirit in the Spider-Man world has been damaged. People don't even respect Spider-Man as they used to.
right. I mean, people look down on his status as a kid. We see other ways that people look down on his status later that I want to call out. But it taints his image, and it literally taints his image in the movie as well. Because of the green paint. I'm not sure exactly when it happens. Um,
So, and I would be curious to hear what they say on EFAP about Peter's decision here. Because you were saying that Mahler agrees with it. There's
no,
nothing wrong with
it's
it.
so they're not thinking about it mythologically, obviously, and so Mahler compares it to a time that he said that he had a filling that was loose. So we went into the dentist to have them take a look at it. And they said, okay, yeah, we'll take care of it for you. So he's down in the chair. He's got his mouth open and they got the pick and they're picking at that filling and it's loose. And they say, oh, yep. And they start picking at it. They're like, we're going to take it out. And he's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. What are you doing? Like, you haven't like numbed me up. Are you going to replace it? And he's like trying to say that while his mouth is open and they're working. They're like, well, like now's not really the time to talk because I got my tools in your mouth. And he's like, look, are you going to replace the filling? They were like, well, no, we're not going to be able to replace it immediately. And he was like, well, it's just a little loose. I don't want to walk around with a hole in my tooth. And so he had to stop them when they were doing it because it wasn't discussed with him what the terms were going to be of them
Right.
helping him.
But
Right.
and see, the thing is with that, I understand the
And I get it.
analogy,
Right.
but at the same time, it wasn't like Mahler's spirit was
So
damaged
this is why I
by,
said it's like a
yes.
genie
It is like a genie.
because Strange's, and I think this for most people, this is like character assassination for Strange in a sense because of how irresponsible it is. It's so irresponsible that Strange has his own movie reconciling the fact that he's done this, but people are not happy with the fact that Strange did it because it's basically like, why would you walk with Peter down there and not explain to him, hey, I can't stop the spell once I start, and no
Because
one, and including me, no one is even going to know who you are. And so that doesn't logically make sense to people, which I get because he says to him
no, I don't know.
so he says to him while he's casting the spell,
I don't think
goodbye,
it's
Peter Parker.
assassination because it's the he understands that that's the wish,
Yes.
right? He is instantiated as the
Now,
magical,
because
the
you see him
mystical.
as that genius or that genie, or the wish, the fulfillment of that
But
wish, right?
when Peter, right, the individual spirit calls out to the genie,
Hmm.
right, the genie will answer the call.
Yeah.
And so I don't think it's character assassination. Just my opinion.
But with the so since they didn't understand sort of that aspect of it or hadn't thought about how he is playing a genie motif out for Peter here, it was basically like it was so stupid of him to do this, right? Because he starts casting the spell before he ever explains to Peter that
It's because it's not a
it's going to work that
logical
way.
it's not a logical
Yeah.
art, let's say.
And so the funny thing is they're arguing on logical terms, and they had a guest that became essentially hysterical about it almost. They were raising their voice quite a bit and talking over everybody, and it was kind of strange. But they were so emotionally invested in disagreeing with the assessment that Peter hadn't done anything wrong,
But and
and
there's
it
multiple
and it
reasons.
makes sense, but they could not articulate why.
But there's multiple reasons too why it wouldn't be explained, because this is the instantiation of Peter's spirit into the world trying to affect reality around him.
Hmm.
And so when that process begins, you can't undo it. That's why the spell can't be stopped.
Right.
It can be altered. You can speak more, you can put more of your spirit out into
You're
the
like,
world.
unless, but, and you
Eh,
can keep on
But
essentially
as you
adding
do
on to
that,
what
you
your statement is,
disintegrate your spirit more and
and
more
it becomes
until
less true.
it it your spirit is so disintegrated that it could be replaced by another instantiation, which we'll get to in a minute.
Yeah.
But let's finish up this summary.
Right. So Strange does cast the spell, fulfilling that wish for Peter. But as Peter is listening to him, he keeps interrupting and saying, "Well, I don't want everyone to forget who I am. I really need to keep." And it's not that they're going to forget at this point anyway. It's not articulated this way, but that they're just going to forget who Peter Parker is. Basically, anyone who knew that Peter was Spider-Man is going to forget that he's Spider-Man. So it starts out with a minor objection where he says that he doesn't want MJ to forget. I think it starts with MJ, and then he remembers Ned, and he's like, "Oh, well, I really don't want Aunt May to forget that I'm Spider-Man because that's really difficult, and it caused all these things to happen." And it's like, and it, I think that there, um, I think at that point, whenever Peter is objecting and he's saying, "I don't want to go through all that with Aunt May again because it was a complicated situation when she found out that I was Spider-Man," kind of reveals a bit of what's going on and what's wrong in this situation, right? Which is that he's,
And why
it,
it is that adversarial, selfish side of Peter that's
yeah,
taking over as more and more this disintegrated side of
right.
Peter, let's say, as more and more of himself is put out there into the
Right.
spell.
So it eventually becomes too much. The spell's destabilized, and then I can't remember the exact wording of the last thing that Peter says, but he's just like, "I just want everybody to remember I'm Spider-Man." Right? He says something along those lines, right?
I want everybody to remember, everybody who remembers that I'm Spider-Man to remain remembering that I'm Spider-Man.
Yeah, something along those lines.
Yeah.
And Strange basically has the world fall away around them, and then he contains the spell down into a sphere and says that it's been controlled now, but essentially that Peter shouldn't have tried to change his wording, right? And so that was something funny that happened on Mahler, though, because the guest was very upset that Peter kept on talking when he was told not to talk. But the objection was, what would you do in that situation if you didn't know the context? Would you just let yourself be erased, right? So logically speaking,
If you're a hero, yeah.
if you're a hero, yes. If
And
you're
that's the
not a hero,
no.
so. And that, I think that's why people get so animated
You smoke a
in,
lot?
in arguing that point, right? Um,
Yeah.
so Strange berates Peter afterwards after finding out that Peter didn't even try to contact the MIT acceptance board before coming to him to request a potentially universe-ending spell. Um, so he ridicules him and says, "You didn't exhaust all other possibilities before coming to me with this
To the
kind of wish."
genie, right?
Right.
Before coming to the extreme of a genie, which is that which brings forth from the unknown, right? From the magical, from the mystical.
Right.
Before calling on that magnificent power, he didn't even try any of the other avenues before him.
And so it's kind of funny because the Mahler crew disagreed sort of a little bit back and forth about that because um, on one side they would say that, well, Strange didn't explain everything to Peter and it's Strange's fault. But of course, Strange is right for berating Peter in this moment because acting as that mystical force, right? He takes himself seriously in a way that someone as immature as Peter does not
Well,
respect. Not on the level that he should. He doesn't take him
he expects Peter to because of what they've been through together as well. Part of it is the
right.
backstory.
And that's, well, that's also the thing, right? The mismatch between the identity and the heroic identity, right? And so he also has misjudged Peter by his heroic identity, right? And so that is also a setup for this being possible to happen in the first place. And so he thinks he's dealing with Spider-Man when really he's dealing with Peter.
Yes. That's a good way of putting it.
Um so but yeah, that identity being a big part of this movie, it's great how it is true in that sense. You know, as you're looking at it, you understand like it needs to play that role so that we can get to such a great ending for this movie. So Parker goes to the Alexander Hamilton Bridge and tries to convince an MIT administrator to accept Leeds and MJ's applications. Suddenly, the bridge is attacked by Otto Octavius, who rips Parker's nanotechnology from his Iron Spider suit, causing it to bond with his mechanical tentacles. Upon discovering that this isn't the Peter Parker that he had previously fought, Octavius has his robotic arms disabled by the nanotechnology before being captured and placed in a holding cell in the Sanctum Sanctorum, along with Kurt Connors, who has been captured by Strange. So this whole situation,
On the bridge, yeah. You forgot to mention who interrupts them, but that's okay.
well, we'll get to that.
Let's first address his plea for Leeds and MJ's application. I suppose that's a good place to start.
So, again, the garments on the person, or you could say the suit that they're wearing, is symbolic because he goes down onto the bridge and then
As
he takes off
Spider-Man.
his nano suit, and he's got a crumpled suit on underneath. Right? It's really like it's all creased up and it doesn't look good because
Unlike
he's been
the
wearing
Iron
it
Spider.
underneath the Iron Spider suit. And so this is the movie playing with that even more and showing that there's not room for two suits here, right?
That one will negate the other.
Right? You can't have both. And so she looks at him and doesn't take him very seriously. And as he's trying to give his speech, he hasn't really rehearsed it. And so he kind of stumbles over his words. And she's like, "Oh, you didn't really rehearse that, did you?" And I like that it happens that way because it shows authenticity, right? She sees innocence in Peter whenever he does that. If he came up with this like well-rehearsed speech, she could interpret it to be more like Spider-Man coming and being a persona to her, right? And so she really needs to see Peter for Peter. And so Peter stumbling over his words and having the crumpled up suit is not what Peter wants, but what is better for Peter to be able to get the balance that he needs, right?
Sure, yeah.
And so as he's trying to convince her that he's not convincing her for himself, that trying to convince her to take MJ and Ned's applications seriously because they didn't do anything wrong. And then he says, "I didn't do anything wrong," and then gets tongue-tied, right? And so he's trying to...
Well, because he doesn't want to...
He's trying to virtue signal, though, right?
Yeah.
Because that's why he gets tangled up, is because he's trying to express to her that he's not doing it he's not doing it for that reason, but by even mentioning it, he poisons the well. And again, he doesn't know when to stop saying the words for his spell. And he's doing the same thing again, right?
He's casting a spell.
He's saying, "Hey, I want you to let them in." And then he continues to extrapolate on what it would mean. And then he's like, he has to defend himself all of a sudden, right?
Because
both identities are there.
What is it? It wouldn't be... I don't think it would be integration. What do I want to say? It's like the compiling of both identities, right?
Mm-hmm. And so,
but the mix match, is that a good way to put it?
Mix match.
What do I want to say? The discordance.
Yeah,
between the two identities.
That's a good way of putting it.
Okay,
Yeah.
there we
The
go.
imbalance.
And so then we have Otto Octavius. So let's talk a little about Otto Octavius.
So we're gonna have to jump around a little bit on this recording so that we can establish really who Otto Octavius is sufficiently. Otto Octavius from the original Raimi films. Let's set up what he is. So similar to Iron Man, here's another, and there are many of these, technological father type figure for Peter from those movies, who wanted to harness the power of the sun in the palm of his
Icarus
hands.
Type, yeah.
And was corrupted by the tentacles that he attached to himself to be able to do that.
Yes.
And became the tool by which it moved.
Right, instead of the other way around. He became possessed of that spirit, right? And
the first thing that he says to him whenever he arrives in this movie is, "Where's my machine? Where did you take it? The power of the sun in the palm of my hand." So we're being established that they know what he is. And that's what I liked immediately upon seeing him in this film. He has that line, and the way that he's acted it out, I was like, "Oh, wait a second! I think the writer is actually
onto it, yeah.
like bringing something to the table with his character."
The seeking of enlightenment, right, this is the paternal spirit you're talking about, right?
Mm-hmm.
That sun spirit trying to become the sun, almost a Solaire spirit.
Well, Otto
But
Octavius
he's
has
been
goggles too, right?
blinded. Yeah, I was gonna say
Yeah.
he's been blinded, right, by that ambition, and as a blind father, right,
He's lashing out at everybody
uh-huh,
now, as the Ox King
because
was in Dragon
he's
Ball.
become a tyrant. It's the same
He's
thing, yeah.
tyrannized, yeah. And so the mechanistic, the mode, I should say, the mode of being in order to act out what you would have to do to harness the power of the sun in the palm of your hands, then can take control of you, and that's something that like Alexander the Great worried about, right? In what we know of what he had said, right? This idea, and then you also hear that from I think Napoleon talks about how he felt like
Unstoppable
he
until
was
he
moved by
wasn't.
fate, right?
Yeah.
The winds of fate guided him
Well,
as he
he was
went.
saying that it didn't matter what. This is just a paraphrase, but it doesn't matter what the enemy could throw at him as long as the winds of fate are
Right.
on his
He was
side.
on the wave, right?
Right, and as soon as he said too, like, as soon as they're done with me, I'll be nothing.
Yeah. So,
Pretty wise, but pretty. I mean, Napoleon's a whole. Let's not get into that.
but so we have him being reintroduced now at this specific time to show up, and
Why is that? Because the expression of Peter's spirit into the world has become tainted, such that his ambition has exceeded his moral framework, like a tyrant would do. And so the ambition here to the son Octavius, it has to be Octavius right now that is doing this.
well, also the reason that he thinks he can have that level of ambition is connected to the it's also connected to his superhero identity, or specifically I would say the suit given to him by Tony, right?
Right, yeah.
And so that's why they have the interaction that they have with the nanotechnology that works out canonically. They didn't have to break any rules to do it, surprisingly. But the situation where he strikes at his heart with one of the tentacles and the nano suit stops it, right? The suit that was given to him by his last master stops the piercing blow to his heart and then pulls away a chunk of it, right?
And neutralizes.
And then it merges with the tentacles. And then the technology
Of Doc Ock.
and the technology that Peter has inherited from Iron Man then takes control of those tentacles for Peter. And then Peter can bind him, right?
Yes, and he can control him. And that's to say that the boons of the technological father, Tony Stark, aren't completely lost. In fact, one here is able to neutralize the blind father's spirit here of Octavius.
Right. And it's, it plays out in a very Ox King like way with an
And
Ox
it,
King
it
like
is,
character.
but it is the sacrifice of the more glossy, fashionable, heroic spirit that the Iron Spider had become, right?
Well, that's the reason that Peter pulls out his four legs and fights him that way, right?
Yes,
'Cause
exactly.
it's like, oh, well, I already have that from my spiritual father, right?
Yes,
And so,
but it's like it's still unearned.
but he has
and
to give it
so
up, right?
he
Symbolically,
has
he
to,
gives
yeah.
it up to bind that one. So it's like, how many spiritual fathers can you deal with, right? Because it's to beg the question, how many times can you be Tony Stark? How many times can you convince yourself that you're him? Because that's what he's dealing with. That's the responsibility that he theoretically should be taking on with some of the deeds that he's done and some of the irresponsibility with that technology he's shown, right? And so that's that discordance appearing here. So he has to sacrifice that to control
Yep.
him. Now at this point I know
Well, and it's one level of separation, right? He's done with the Iron Spider suit, so he's able to dissociate that from Peter Parker.
right.
So it's the first step because we're going to see more progression of this.
Which
as
this
we
is
go on.
also to say symbolically that Peter is not associating his personal character with the ambitions of Tony Stark
Yes.
by giving up the boons of Tony Stark to subdue the tyrannical version of Tony Stark, which is the other technological father that comes in and does what he does.
Yeah.
Well, I think we got to it.
Yeah, definitely.
Now at this point in the story, also, Peter has had his original suit that we saw from I think Homecoming has been tainted as well. Someone has thrown green paint on it, and he can't wash it off. We've seen that he was trying to wash it in the sink at Happy's place whenever they think have they gone to Happy's yet? I think they're
Then-
just about to actually.
Uh,
But
yeah, they're about to.
yeah, so I just want to establish there was a montage
first
whenever that
have to
happened
go-
because but I wanted to tie that into him having to give up the one that he got
Yes,
from.
there was a montage.
But so this is to establish though that he doesn't have a suit now, right? Like one that isn't tainted or one that hasn't had to be damaged, right? So he needs to get a suit that he can use to go and continue to be Spider-Man in the wake of what now his spell has summoned. So that situation, I want to make sure that pointed out he doesn't have either. So right at the end of this, he goes back up. He talks to the woman from MIT in admissions, and he has saved her from this, right? So he's rescued her, and he comes to her and he's like, I can still get you to your flight, right? So now he shows his virtue instead of saying it. So instead of him wording out a spell to her and trying to convince her, I'm not doing this for myself, right? He rescues her life, and then the first thing he thinks about is, hey, let me help you, right?
Mhm.
So he proves it with his actions now. And then she says, you're a hero. And he said, well, I was telling you, I wasn't doing it for me. She's like, no, I can see it now. You're a hero. I'll talk to them about all three of you. And and she's adamant that she's choosing to do it not for him as a favor, but because she believes that he would be good for MIT, right? So,
Well, and also that
and
she
so,
believes in the heroic spirit of Spider-Man.
right. And so he put it into balance for a second, right? By binding the tyrannical father real quick that showed up, he puts things into at least that stasis, right? He
It's
fixes
just
that problem
that
for now.
he has caused more chaos than he's able to deal with.
And we see that right as he gets portaled out because we see Green Goblin swooping in, throwing
a
his
pumpkin bomb,
grenades.
yeah, right there to blow up the bridge.
Mm-hmm.
And so then they get transported out by Strange, and they go back to the Sanctum Sanctorum.
I want to point out the juxtaposition there too, because of the amount of effort that Peter went to save this one woman on her way to her flight, and then all these cars just being exploded by the pumpkin
Yeah.
bombs. Like, okay, you got the idea, but that's not enough. Like, the chaos is already escalated.
Well, and that's because the dissociation, right, is going to cause that to happen. It's going to cause that multiplicity of chaos, which is some of these visitors that we'll see. But go ahead and
So
yeah.
they arrive back at the Sanctum Sanctorum,
Sanctum Sanctorum.
and Strange reveals that his spell has begun bringing everybody from every part of the multiverse who knows Peter Parker is Spider-Man into their world. Doesn't really make sense with the text of what they said in the spell. So this is kind of one of those instances where I think that the mythological reasoning is superseding the logical reasoning because some of the people who show up do not fit within this criteria, right?
It's true.
But that's what Strange says. Now, there was a good point that Mahler brought up. I think Mahler brought up in his EFAP that we're recklessly trusting Doctor Strange as a narrator for the context of what's happening because he also has said that he knows dangerously little about the multiverse. So it seems to me that it could be possible that his interpretation of what's happening isn't necessarily sufficient for what Peter has actually caused to happen. And that's some of the blindness that
perhaps it's not
is part of Doctor
those that
Strange.
know who Spider-Man's identity more, that they've been, what do I want to say, they've been instantiated with Peter's spirit in some way or the other. Most of them have died to Peter.
That seems to be part of the through line.
Right. And so they've interacted with that. And actually I think a lot of them do know by the time they die. I don't know about the Amazing though.
Well,
The Amazing Man.
Connors, who's Lizard,
Does he die?
he does not die. So he just gets, I think he's just like taken away
Take him away, boys.
at the end of the first one. I'll be honest, I've only watched those one time each. I wasn't a big fan of them. There were aspects of them that I liked, but by and large, they were not good films, in my opinion.
I didn't even see the second one.
Yeah, you're lucky for that. because the second one is, in my opinion, it's kind of offensive what
But
Sony did with it.
but we'll talk about that
Yeah,
here coming up.
yeah, we will. But the situation is weird though that, well, we'll get into this conversation shortly, but the context of everyone coming here doesn't seem to be clear. Now, that's what Doctor Strange says, and Peter says, "Okay, well, I'm going to need some help to deal with this problem, right?" And he suggests to Strange that he bring MJ and Ned into the Sanctum Sanctorum to help him solve this problem. And I think that that's interesting because I think it's a further articulation of him not learning his lesson and why more villains are able to keep coming into this reality, right? Because he's
It's
not
making it
setting it
worse.
square.
He's making it worse, right?
Right.
By incorporating more identities to take on the consequences of the deeds of Spider-Man, he is multiplying his problem times 3. And what happens? He multiplies his problem times 3.
Yep. It seems like he's creating splits or fractures
Mm-hmm.
by repeatedly not learning his lesson. And so they agree to do it, and, or I should say, Strange agrees to let them do it, right? So he brings them down into the Sanctum Sanctorum, and they look around, and they're all like, "Oh wow, ooh cool." They have some snarky conversation, um, quipping back and forth with Otto and with what's his name, with
Mac?
Connors,
Oh, Connors, yeah.
and there he gets a little bit of information. He questions Octavius about the green elf guy that he saw on the bridge, right? He said, "You knew him, didn't you?" Because Connors calls out Norman or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And he questions him about it, and he says, "We tire of your questions," right? Speaking from the tentacles, and then he expands a little bit on it and just says, "If we see him, then we're seeing a ghost because he died at the hands of Spider-Man." And so I was like, "Ooh, what would that mean?"
Of Spider. Well, doesn't he say he was impaled by his own glider?
Yeah, something like that, right?
Yeah.
But basically, he died fighting Spider-Man. So we have an introduction of a specter of death, right?
Mm-hmm.
So one of the villains brought in is a dead person, right? Now, Otto doesn't know that he's a dead person too in the continuity of this film, but
Not yet.
in the I would say in the context of this scene though, it makes sense that he would be telling them that, right? There's a specter of death now chasing you. Um because it's that ego death. It's like it's going to chase you down and it's going to destroy your identity. Like, and it's going to pursue you. And so that's what the Green Goblins it's like he follows, right?
Mm-hmm.
And comes into the world as, well, I'm curious to hear what your analysis of Green Goblin being here is, because right after this
And the reason why
we
he's
see,
the primary villain in the movie is because his whole thing is having a dissociated identity that has merged into one, right?
right.
That has one dominant over the other, and it's almost Gollum like in the way they interact, and it's an explanation of what can happen if those boundaries aren't made separate and divisive.
Well, this is that thing that happens in a lot of stories, I think, which it's like the hero can look at the villain and see how they could become the villain, right? And that's where that interplay really becomes
Well, that's why
personal.
goblins, yeah.
Yeah.
And the fact that he crushes his helmet right later on is even more evidence of that merging of those identities, right?
Right.
That
And it seems like some of it is a game to Goblin, right? So what he does is he is
well,
Norman
that's
smashes
because
the helmet.
how
Yeah.
Goblin's mode of being, let's say, instead of Norman's mode of
Right.
being,
So
Goblin's mode of being is purely adversarial. He's against being itself and finds joy in the destruction of being. And so that's why it's a game to him, because
right.
hierarchically he's above all of these beings who think they're good. And actually, he points that out in the first movie, about doing good and how people aren't really good, and he doesn't believe that they're good. And that
Right.
adversarial spirit is what drives him.
So that's why I wanted to say it seems to me that Goblin is allowing Norman to make decisions to get him closest to the place where he can inflict the most damage, right?
Definitely, yeah.
And I've heard a criticism of the movie that he's not enough like how he was in the Raimi films because it was more of a merging of those identities that made him so
But
malicious, right? But I don't think that this betrays that. You know, I think that this actually is sort of like the introduction of Goblin to Peter's story should be an unmasking, right? And it should be the danger lurking underneath the
I believe Green Goblin is the only villain to take off Spider-Man's mask successfully and like reveal his identity. I can't remember if that's true though.
that I wouldn't know.
I think it's a comic thing. Go ahead.
But yeah, I think that it's like that though. He comes in and he unmasks
But
himself, and
what's
then he becomes a
more,
foil in that sense because underneath that it's like when you are that way, the way that you think you are can actually be the real mask, right? You create a mask out of yourself, and
well,
something
let's
else
take
occupies
this.
yourself.
Let's take this. The we were talking about the tyrannical spirit that has corrupted Otto, right?
Right.
That spirit is somewhat transposed, or let's say not, maybe not transposed, but like similar in a way to Goblin's mode of being. But the difference is between them is that Goblin's mode of being is far exceeding that in terms of it's not aiming for a higher goal. It's aiming for destruction.
No, it's
And that's
aimed downward, right?
why it's so powerful in its
Well,
mode.
that's
But
the biblical thing.
another thing, and this is even more important, is that the father figure that needs to be redeemed is not Octavius. It's Norman.
Right.
And so that's why there's that split there, and why at the end making that and destroying that split identity is able to do what it does. But we'll get there.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can also look at how would I say? You can look at Norman as a shadow of Tony Stark, right? The
Mhm.
dead father,
I'm
right?
something of a scientist
I'm
myself.
something of a scientist myself, yeah. So, but he's occupying that space because he's more of the spiritual masculine in the story than say like Otto would be, right?
Mhm.
And so it's really getting at the heart of
Instead of the
yeah,
technological,
or
right?
the logos
But
oriented, you could say.
they're kind of those representations. So
Um, so yeah, I think that that's what's happening and why he comes in. Now it's interesting because he wanders right into a feast building, which is where Aunt May essentially it's like a food kitchen mixed with like amenities for homeless people and stuff. It's basically just a purely altruistic thing, right? So I think it's interesting that Aunt May does this in these films and how he had talked about um the a good deed is its own reward, right?
yeah,
And how that's associated with your anonymity, you could say. So with that anonymity, it is it is evident why Aunt May is able then later to like help Spider-Man the way that she is. But it's interesting though that to get to Spider-Man, the first thing that the spirit does is it goes directly to Aunt May's expression of that out in the world, right?
before we get there, we do need to mention. I'm not even on. There we go. Before we get there, we do need to mention the cube and how Peter at any time can
Oh yes, of
kill
course.
them all.
Is that yet? Because I thought that was after he captured Electro.
I'm pretty sure it's revealed to him early on.
Well, as soon as he sees the cube, he takes it away from Strange, and they have their fight in the
Okay.
same scene.
Okay. Never mind. Then. Never mind.
Um, sorry, I'm just looking at my summary here. Just says they find and capture Max Dillon and Flint Marko.
Yeah.
So I feel like my summary is skipping forward pretty quickly. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this then, because before we get deep into the Norman Osborn reveal and how he starts getting at Peter, I guess we have to reconcile the fact that we have Electro and Sandman that Peter goes and does his little hunting mission with. So what Strange does is he gives Peter a piece of technology that he can use to,
Is it technology?
well, it's Strange's
Mysticism.
it's a piece of mysticism. Yeah,
I would say that's a better way of putting it.
it's a piece of mysticism that Peter can wear around his wrist. He fires it at someone, and it portals them here into the containment that Strange has created in the Sanctum Sanctorum. They do a little bit of research with the help of MJ and Ned. He does a little bit of research to see who, or to see what's been going on around the city, because Strange tells him there should be a lot of rumblings about crazy stuff going on because people are being pulled into our dimension. So with their help, he finds Electro, and we see a scene of him here in the Sanctum Sanctorum. He's trying to wash off his suit here in Strange's sink, and it doesn't work here, right? And what he's been trying to do this whole time is to clean that his image of what it means to be Spider-Man, in a sense, I think, right?
Which is tainted right now by Peter Parker, which, like green paint, cannot be erased.
So what he decides to do,
Well, it can be, but
whenever they find this disruption, which is outside of like a power plant, I think, or a military base, is he turns his suit inside out, and he tapes a phone to his chest that is a live camera feed to MJ and Ned to talk to him, because his Stark technology is offline, and he can't use the voice in his head to help him. So he tries to use MJ and Ned for that and turns his suit inside out. So as far as symbolic things happening in this movie, what do you think that would mean?
well, that's why the friends are there, because those are Peter's friends, right? It's
Mhm.
turning the identity out to where Peter is the one that's kind of presenting. And
Yeah.
it's interesting too, because when Flint Marko meets them, he befriends Spider-Man immediately, knowing who he is as Peter, right?
Yeah.
And so yeah, it is that. It's the
Not knowing that he's Spider-Man, but
inverse.
knowing that he's Peter, right?
He calls him Peter, I
Yeah.
think, maybe.
I think so.
Yeah, and so yeah, that's definitely when he turns his suit inside out and exposes his vulnerabilities as well, because the phone gets destroyed.
Right. Well, it's actually, it functions as a good thing for him that the phone gets destroyed, because what's happening is, as he encounters Electro, which I want to point out what's going on with Electro. So Jamie Foxx returns.
Yay!
As well, I guess we should have maybe said a little bit more about Alfred Molina, because his performance as Doc Ock is fantastic in
Oh
this.
yeah, definitely.
And I also prefer Jamie Foxx in this movie to Amazing Spider-Man. So what happens is they basically recast. Yeah, I guess this may be the first instance of someone recasting an actor with themselves, because we have a different Jamie Foxx in this film. When we see him, he's absorbing all of this electricity, and he changes colors from blue to yellow, and he says that the energy feels different here. And he basically looks like Jamie Foxx instead of looking like the weird nerd that he looked like in the last one. And he essentially sees his new body. He's like, oh, I like it here. And they just kind of play it off. I actually like that they do it. I'm a fan of it, because in this instance, they know that's what the fans want, right? They want a better Electro. And so, and Sony, in their involvement with this, it's kind of inspiring to me to see that a company would do what they did, because old Electro looked horrible. The fans were kind of like, I don't know about this. He was basically Dr. Manhattan.
Oh, he looks so bad.
Yeah.
I just pulled up a picture.
Yeah, so you didn't watch 2, but it wasn't good.
Ooh, that looks bad.
And so they bring him back and they make him look like
Electro.
He's
And
got the star on his face, right?
Well, when he's using his powers and when he's like hyped up on electricity, yeah, he has the original mask, and it's kind of a silhouette of it, which is just a really good homage without making it overly like silly that he would have that on.
No, he doesn't walk around with a big yellow like star
green and
smacked
yellow
onto his head.
He doesn't have his green and yellow costume,
Yeah.
but he does have the
electricity forms
resemblance,
around him
yeah.
to resemble his suit, which is more what people, I think, want out of Electro,
besides becoming a blue man.
becoming Dr. Manhattan.
Yeah.
So he's attacking Peter, and Peter is trying to get in position to disable his ability to use electricity the way that he is. And MJ and Ned are yelling in his ears, telling him, go left, go right, do this, do that. And it's confusing him, and it gets him like knocked into the ground. And so I like that that's what happens, right? Because his suit is turned inside out, and he's trying to use his personal life as his persona in this fight, in a sense. And it's not working. And the voice of MJ and Ned is not the voice that will help him be able to do what he needs to do as Spider-Man, right? And so he has to learn that here, because he was handed that voice in his head by Tony. He gave him basically a voice in his head that would tell him what to do to be on the right path to do the good thing.
And so he's like, let me keep using these crutches. I have
And
to
so
make
what he
my
does,
own bootleg crutches.
he's like, who can guide me to do the right thing in the situation where it matters? Well, I guess I'll lean on my friends then, right?
But
Naturally.
and that's kind of also what it's interesting, because that happens as a process of adolescence as well.
Right.
And I think people eventually learn again to appreciate their parents more. But I mean, when I was a teenager, right? I mean, it's
Absolutely not.
that spirit of rage against the machine, let's say.
Yeah, don't heed the words of your ancestors, but your peers, right?
And so that's what Peter thinks can replace the spirit of the father, which is
the voice of the spirit of the father in his head, which doesn't work, obviously. So he captures both of them, He also accidentally captures a tree for a nice little comedic moment, because whenever he first tries to, and this is how they kind of play the gag with Jamie Foxx getting a new body, is when he first tries to shoot him with the mystical device to capture him, he doesn't have a body. He's like disembodied.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's like just pure energy. And he mentions that later on, that he was pure energy, and then he got a new body when he came into this world, right? That's literally the reason they give, which is hilarious.
The logic doesn't matter.
So he misses him and hits a tree, and then so he captures them. Sandman is confused. He's like, why'd you shoot me, Peter?
Yeah.
What's going on?
And he's like, you're not Peter.
And he's like, also, you're not Peter. What? So at this point, also, because Sandman recognizes that this isn't Peter as he knows Peter, now there's a doubt as to whether or not Sandman's going to continue to side with Tom Holland's Peter.
Yeah.
So, with them now put away in their cells, Peter still needs to deal with a very important situation. And they find the other person. And it's Norman Osborn, as Norman Osborn, who has gone to Feast seeking help. And so we get a nice dramatic scene where he's running in to go see what's going on. And then he rushes in and he sees Norman in his nice purple hoodie sitting there talking to Aunt May. And
that purple hoodie's so cool.
And Aunt May is essentially telling Peter that they have a responsibility to help somebody like him who's not well, right? That the victim status of Norman Osborn in relationship to Goblin is worthy of Peter Parker.
Well, she doesn't even know he's Goblin.
Right, but she doesn't even know that. She just knows that as a person.
Which is, I think this could have been better articulated had Aunt May known that the whole point of Goblin was the redemption of the spirit of the father that is Norman. Because the redemption of the spirit of the father prevents literal garbage called Spider-Man 3.
Basically. This whole, I mean, it's like...
It actually does, and that's the thing. Both meta, and that's why it's kind of blowing.
That's why it's great that it wasn't James Franco in this film, but an amazing performance from Willem Dafoe.
Yeah, and it's that meta redemption as well of the spirit of the hero, which is encapsulated here in the redemption of the spirit of the father in Norman.
And so Aunt May has the intuition that helping this representation that he is the right thing for Peter to do. And so she convinces Peter not to just shoot him with the teleportation device, and instead he brings him over to the Sanctum Sanctorum from the other side, right? So he comes in voluntarily, whereas the rest of them had to be shot in. Even Sandman, where before Aunt May interjected and said, "Hey, you shouldn't treat your adversaries this way just by category. Um, you need to be more discerning." Before she said that, of course, he just sent Sandman back. So Sandman had a different experience coming here than, say, Osborn did, who came in um, voluntarily, sort of, and so he's playing that sort of traitor um, aspect out, right? So he comes in uh, and has a
Well, wait, I don't
conversation
know
with
about that. I
Doctor
don't know if it's a
Octotoman.
traitor aspect because it is the genuine presentation of vulnerability that Goblin is exploiting with
Right.
Norman.
Well, that's the sort of traitorous thing, though, behind
It's the
Goblin at the end of the
dangling.
day.
It's the knowledge of the heroic spirit, and
Yeah.
Goblin does this in the first movie too. He knows what Spider-Man is more than
Right.
Spider-Man
Well,
knows what
what I
he is.
mean is traitorous in the sense that Goblin has the intent to yank it away
Yeah.
and to have essentially it be perceived as a betrayal of
Well,
what
the
was
reason I
someone
don't
who
want to
would
say
be
it's
a helpful spirit,
the
right?
reason I don't want to say it's a betrayal is because it is Goblin exploiting the natural course of the spirit of the hero to redeem the spirit of the father, him using that as a weapon
Right.
against Peter.
Well, it gets Peter to interpret him as being on his side, right?
Right. Well, and
Um,
that I see what you mean too, but it wouldn't be a betrayal of the spirit of the
sure,
father,
yeah.
but it would be a betrayal of that path, right? Like you took this path, which is the right path, and you failed anyways. That's what Goblin is trying to
Well,
get at.
that's the pure destruction that Goblin's doing, right? So that's why I'm saying that
Oh,
he
Goblin's
wants
so
him to
good.
experience what feels like a betrayal from that technological father, right? He wants to tear down Peter's relationship to the father by his actions, right?
It's not even father. It's not even the father though, but it's like it's more of the act of being on the way or trying
Yeah.
to do that, right? It's a betrayal of that idea. Not a betrayal.
What I mean is,
It's an attack on his faith.
yes, an attack on faith is what I'm saying, right?
I think that's a
His
better way to say it.
because destroying his reverence towards that father's spirit
And
is
his
to
faith
destroy his
that
faith,
he can
right?
redeem it.
Right.
That's what Goblin's
And
after.
that's why Goblin is
And why
going
is that
through the motions here.
why is that what Goblin is after? Is because that is what allows Peter to reestablish order by separating out Spider-Man and Peter Parker and re-becoming that chivalric spirit. But it can't be done
Right.
until one base establishes the base once again of the heroes that came before, the ancestral spirits, let's say.
Right, and it's great that the villains before are like these ancestral villains, right? So it plays
Yes.
out in a mythological sense, like
In a
he's
meta sense as well,
grappling
it's like, yeah.
with, you know, our mythology moves at a faster rate with the way that information flows, right? And so in a meta sense, like Willem Dafoe comes into this movie like a mythological villain, like
He's
he's
larger than life. He
well,
steals
he
the
is. I
show
watched
because
him
he
as
is,
a
yeah.
villain in my formative years, right? I watched Spider-Man 1 and 2 over and over and over when I
They're
was a
really
kid.
good.
And so he shows up as himself in this movie. So it meta steps into that realm of mythology and feels like it when you're watching it. And so you really get that sense that it's of a bigger scope automatically.
And here's some more proof too, and this is something that I want to mention. That Goblin is after the destruction of the heroic spirit, much like Joker is after the destruction of the heroic spirit. Unlike
yes.
Venom, who is after the destruction of Spider-Man himself, right?
Hmm.
And what Spider-Man represents, not necessarily what the heroic spirit is. And this is proven by in the first movie, right? Goblin allows Peter to live. He puts him to sleep, could have just killed him, right? Could have unmasked him, but he doesn't. He chooses to do that so he can prove to him that the heroic spirit will fail.
Right. And that's what he does over and over, right? And
And
we
that's
see
what
this
he
in a lot of
wants
other
to do
stories
here,
as well.
yeah.
It's great though because he's
And
doing the right thing
But
for his character.
logically,
Yeah.
it's like, oh, but this character should just kill him right now. It's like it could all be over right now. It's like, but that's not what.
See,
what's
everyone
happening.
wants to dial it down to that everything is just a power expression
And
in
instead
their
of
power fantasies, right?
well, people that the trope of the villain monologuing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, isn't necessarily always as simple as that, because it could be there's more of a goal besides just the goal in front of them. There's a larger mythological meaning behind their
Yeah, I
actions.
honestly think that the villain monologuing the way that they do is sloppy story writing for people who are trying to have them fulfill the
What we're
appropriate
trying to say
mythological
right
role,
now,
right?
like what Goblin is.
Because he's doing it through his actions in this story, which makes it relatable, which makes it true, and he doesn't have to monologue. I'm here to tear down your idea of
Yeah,
what is good, Mister
right,
Parker.
exactly.
Like he's not doing that. He's through his actions reducing his faith, right?
Yes.
And
And
so that's why I kind of wanted to frame it in
it's
that
like
sense.
it's
Because
almost like a Jobian thing, right?
sure, yeah,
Yeah. Like, and that's, I'm just thinking about that now,
hmm
because Job is actually a really good analog for Spider-Man himself, because in Spider-Man's instantiations in the past, and most of what we know of as Spider-Man, he usually is suffering, and it's all that suffering he can take and still have faith that his responsibility is worth accepting, that makes his character so redeemable, and it's so
sure.
endearing.
That's the meta story of 3 and the story of 3, right? Because
Yeah.
there's this thing that happens with
Oh
the
God.
approach to it, but at the same time um but that's literally what happens in the story too, where
Hmm.
there's this he's the ego takes full
He
control, you
rejects
know.
the faith, right?
Yeah, he rejects the faith. He relies on his own
And that's
intellect and
why he ends
his
up at the church, by the way.
well, yeah. Well, and that's similar to why we're going to end up at a national monument at the end of this movie.
Yes. So let's continue. I
Um
think we're at
pretty good like halfway
however
mark.
Parker wants to cure.
Yeah. So Peter agrees with Aunt May to help him, and we go
To help
back to the
Goblin.
sanctum to
Well,
help Goblin.
Norman.
Well, Norman in his mind.
Let's be
But by
precise.
doing so, what's really great is when they get back there to the sanctum, we see maybe not right away, but Peter thanks Aunt May for washing his suit for him. We don't see it happen. It's not explained in the moment. He doesn't show up with his suit and show it to her and be like, "Please, can you wash this for me?" But know that the green paint on Spider-Man's suit now has been washed off by Aunt May because he went to he basically helped or
He
agreed
took
with her
one step. Yeah.
to help the spiritual father rather than to attack it, right? And so that's what the proper role for the feminine and masculine should be, that when the heroic spirit does something to
I don't know
respect
about, you said help or attack it. I don't know if it's attack it. I think it's more of the oh man, I had it. I just had it.
well, I do
Now
want
I
to
have it
say that
empty.
the proper place for the feminine in relation to the masculine, we've kind of been talking about this before, seems to be that it supports the heroic in its endeavors whenever it's doing the right thing. And
Right.
then and the hero should be able to look at that support as a validation for their heroic spirit. And that's what that is that's his suit, right? And it's cleaning it for him so he feels validated as being Spider-Man and still doing the right thing by the approval that he gets through Aunt May, who shows him, right, that an act of good is for itself, right?
Well, and
And
it's
so he acts it out, and then also we see it
mhm.
symbolically displayed in his ability now to wear his suit again.
Yes. And so he's able to wear his own suit.
Yeah,
Is it from Homecoming?
I think it's his homecoming suit. Yeah,
Yeah. And so yeah, I don't think you have that here, but they do get back to the prison,
yeah.
and
So
everyone's in there now.
so yeah, so he tells everybody that he wants to essentially help them before he sends them back because reasons. I mean, he doesn't necessarily have a logical reason to think that healing them here will fix their fates where they came from, but he says maybe it can happen, and that seems to be good enough for the movie logic. And it's good enough for your brain because it is fulfilling what he should do in this situation, right?
Well, curing them meaning redeeming
Curing
the
meaning redeeming, right?
right. And that's what the heroic spirit has the propensity to do, is redeem the spirits around them, redeem the people around them, the society around them, whatever it is.
Right.
And not all of these are paternal spirits, obviously. I think there's some lacking thematic threads from the Amazing movies. Both the villains from the Amazing movies are more insubstantial in their mythological significance as opposed to the ones from the original Sam Raimi trilogy.
Yeah, listening to this, it'll become pretty evident why people don't like the Amazing movies because, I mean, I do have some things to say, and I have some things to say about Lizard, but it's by and large they don't play the same
But
sorts
they
of roles for Peter's character in the movies they show up in.
right, and the thing with like the Lizard, for example, is that his redemption it isn't an acknowledgement really that he is wrong. It's just it turns him back into a human. So, uh, what happens then is after they're all back down there, Doctor Strange reveals that he has set up a little box that can send all of them back to their original universes, let's say. And I think we may have just covered this, but the cure, I mean, we're talking about those cures right now. And so he actually has to confront Doctor Strange here. And this is to confront the genie, right? To attempt to constrain the genie.
Yeah, it's interesting because the the
Which
genie is a real test of whether or not your actions and your intellect match up, right? Are
but
you
isn't that
worthy
it?
of the goal that you can articulate, right?
Containing the genie is that divine way, the line of infinite possibilities with a container that is finite, right?
Right.
Of the lamp.
Sure. Well, he wants to put the genie back in the lamp here, right? So he's got the little what they'll use as a lamp, right? Where he's I like the idea of it because he has to how do I want to say? I'm not sure exactly how I want to say it with Doctor Strange, but intervening and stopping Doctor Strange from undoing it is actually the right thing for him to do because it's him taking responsibility for his actions. I think it's something along the lines of I need to square the problem I've created instead of just trying to, accept an undo button, right? And so, and that's tied into the responsibility that Aunt May, I think, thematically is trying to impart onto him that you need to be able to fully take on the responsibility of your actions, even though there are actions where you get disproportionate reactions to,
Well, think
to what
about
you've done.
what it is, right? This is the selfless act that he needs to do to redeem his own heroic spirit, because there is no benefit to himself by fixing these villains,
Right.
right? He doesn't. They're in different universes, so there's no point to it. There's no gain for him. There's no
Mm.
personal thing into it, and so that part of
That's a
it,
great way of
which
putting
is the
it. Yeah.
dissociating between Spider-Man and Peter Parker, has to be iterated 5 times, and it has to be done this way so that he can then make that action and that spirit a part of himself again.
Okay. So I think this is going to explain something that really ties things together really well. So how many villains does he gather up here? I think there's 5 of them, right? But
Goblin,
see,
Ox,
Doctor Strange says to him,
Lizard.
"You made me change my spell 6 times." But he only actually should have had to change it 5 times, and we learn at the end of the film later on, but I'll spoil it now. Doctor Strange was one of those people that he changed it for himself because as Peter was expressing his personality, right, and objecting, saying what he would object to, Strange decides during that spellcasting he wants to remember Peter. So in knowing Peter, Strange alters his spell himself one time because at first he says goodbye Peter Parker, and we see later on he doesn't want to forget Peter, and so Peter has to defeat all of these people, and one of the people he has to defeat here is actually Doctor Strange because he also made Doctor Strange part of that spell that he was trying to cast.
And part of that disintegration, because the
Right.
responsibility and the knowledge that Doctor Strange has of that responsibility would interfere with the dissociation,
Mm-hmm.
clearly. And again, the ability for Peter to call on mystical powers at any time, right, has to be re-earned. It's already been lost. Paradise Lost, right? It has to be re-earned.
Well, this is a movie of Paradise Lost in that sense, right?
Right.
That's why Lizard's here.
Here he
That's
is.
the only reason he's here. But
It literally is the only reason he's here, because otherwise he's pretty much a useless character.
right. But
Not to say this is a perfect movie, but it is very good.
it's good. It's good in the sense that hopefully we can explain why there's a critical and an audience consensus, right?
Definitely.
Because it doesn't normally happen that way.
And so Peter actually beats Doctor Strange at his
Yes.
own game by using math, by using logic and the logos to conquer the mystical.
It's pretty interesting. He binds him, actually. He wraps
Yeah.
him up in his web. So
Yes.
he literally uses his logical ability to bind
To
up
confine the genie.
to bind up that what would you call it? More emotional, more mystical, more esoteric interpretation of what should be done, right?
And so then he has to flee the Sanctum Sanctorum. So they go to this is when they go to Happy's apartment. Not until now.
Right.
So an hour ago we mentioned Happy's apartment. We're at 1:40, by the way.
Yep. The so they go back to Happy's apartment, right? And hang on, I'm trying to get recentered on the yeah. So one thing that I think is interesting is that Peter brings all of the villains with him on this whole thing. It's like, and that's what people would call a plot hole. It's like, just like leave them there, go do your thing. But he specifically has to bring them into Happy's apartment, right? And so it feels like a plot contrivance, but not really.
Why is it a plot contrivance?
He doesn't necessarily have to have them with him if
Doesn't
he's just
he
going to
need
go
to?
make.
Because some of them are scientists, first of all.
Right.
Second of all, he needs to be around them to figure out how to cure them, right?
Sure.
I don't know. I don't think it's a plot hole.
Well, I guess it's not a plot. I thought of it a little bit like a plot hole, but realistically speaking, traveling back and forth from the apartment to them to get samples and blah, 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 But what I wanted to point out is that it has to be an act of faith, that he has to trust all of them to come with him and to not act as a villain, right? To not manipulate the good faith of what he's doing. So there's this element of it where it's like, oh, Peter's stupid for doing this, you could say, but also the way that he has to go about it, he has to act out treating them as though they were worth what he's doing for them, right? Instead of leaving them like caged up.
Right. I actually do really.
And so
I
I think
like
that's
that analysis.
I think that's actually the real reason why it has to be.
Yeah. So I don't think it's a plot hole at all.
So it's not. I don't think it's a plot hole at all, but I've heard it sort of referred to that way.
So then Peter successfully cures Doc Ock, and by using Tony Stark's technology,
which breaks
and why
Happy's
is that?
wall.
Because think about what is the thing that breaks the inhibitor chip in the first place in that movie for Doc Ock? Do you remember?
What do you mean specifically? What breaks it?
So, what the inhibitor chip on the back of his neck that was supposed to prevent the arms from taking over.
I thought he destroyed it himself.
No. No. It gets destroyed after Spider-Man, or Peter Parker as Spider-Man, tells him that he needs to shut off the machine because it's uncontrollable. The sun, the radio, or the fission reactor is going out of control.
Right. The Logos has become tyrannical.
He says he has it under control, right? His arrogance, his hubris says he has it under control. And so Spider-Man has to pull the plug. And by pulling the plug, that's what overloads the chip and fries it and explodes it.
Right. It takes the sun away from him.
So
and
the
says,
hubris, right? The hubris of that spirit is redeemed by what? The sacrificial spirit of Tony Stark and the humility that needs to be. And that's so funny. It's so ironic that the humility
self-sacrifice
is from Tony Stark.
Well, the self-sacrifice is higher on the hierarchy, right? That's the Christian story, right?
Yes, and that's another reason why that nanotechnology is able to subdue this is because it directly replaces Tony's story, directly redeems Osborn in a way, or not Osborn, Octavius in a way that Spider-Man doesn't really have to, as long as he's able to sacrifice that connection to Tony, which he is. And so he cures Octavius that way, and Octavius is able to help him then develop cures for the others. Now, This is when
I
I think
love
this
this
is when
part.
Osborn says that I'm something of a scientist myself.
Well, he says it before they go in here, right? Because he's still in his cage, and I'm glad you brought that line up because that's part of, or not when he's in his cage, but whenever he's standing over there in the Sanctum Sanctorum. I mean, he says something about it because he that's that manipulative element behind what Goblin's doing, right? And he's saying like, "Oh well, I'm scientific too." It's almost a call out to the spirit of Tony Stark to say like, "Oh well, you know."
But see, I love how it's portrayed in our modern mythology that we do from those stories we get an anti-scientism point of view,
Yeah.
because what does Peter Parker incorporate that the other scientists don't is that he's also a journalist. He incorporates the ethics into the science that he does.
Hmm.
And that's what's lacking from the others, right? Is that science, the seeking of truth, right, can go further, which is the Luciferian idea.
Right. It's the worship of the intellect.
And so, I'm something of a scientist myself.
And so it's a great like it's a Goblin saying it, right?
It's almost Goblin saying it. You can't tell who's saying it is the great thing.
Yeah. And so it is really great that way. And of course, it is when he goes to finally put the cures on the rest of them, right? Because it's weird how he does it because he's kind of doing it sequentially, just baiting out a response from someone, obviously. But so he puts a device on Electro's chest and says it's going to dissipate all of his electricity. Now, at this point, Electro is not really all that interested in being helped, right?
What is Electro's mythological significance? Because I didn't watch Amazing 2.
He was a nerd who had no faith in himself. He had big gap teeth, and he looked
like a blue guy.
No, he was just like a nerdy guy that Peter Parker saw on the street one time, and he encouraged him. He encouraged him to his face and said, "Hey, you're cool" or something, and he like fixed his hair for him. And this guy became so obsessed with Spider-Man that he had like pictures of him on his wall and stuff. And then he fell into a vat of electric eels. And then he turned into Blue Electro. And then he, like, whenever he was just like going around thrashing stuff, Spider-Man showed up to like fight him. But he was like, "I'm Spider-Man's biggest fan. But also Spider-Man is against me while I'm trashing stuff. Spider-Man's not so cool after all." And then he's a villain. That's what I remember of him in Amazing Spider-Man 2. There's a reason I don't really like that movie very much.
All right, so anyways, he does this for Electro, which I think I'm just taking a stab in the dark here, but I'm thinking that Electro represents that kind of foolish adversarial spirit, like the spirit of, let's say, Team Rocket, that if given the power they would exploit it, but typically they're unable to get the power in the first place, which sounds like the nerdy side of Dylan. I think that's the character's name, Dylan, that we see portrayed here. Would you say that's perhaps? Because it seems to me that would be the only the kind of the best way to read that.
Well,
that he's that foolish adversary.
Look, I'll be a little bit charitable towards him, and it is very foolish and is very young, and I associate seeing him with the way that, to me, an old person, the way that I feel about young people and their addiction to their phones, and this sort of being plugged into the grid, and Electro is this. He's just foolish adversarial.
Because he wants the adversarial games,
and he also like looked up to Spider-Man for the wrong reasons.
Is he truly malicious though? He seems to be.
He's kind of impotent is the problem, and
right?
he's
that's
not
what
taken
I'm
very seriously in this movie.
Impotence, which I would say is another hallmark of Team Rocket, for example, makes him that foolish adversary.
But that's also part of what's wrong with Amazing Spider-Man 2 is because I kind of feel like the foolish adversary is just the adversary of that film. But he
Which makes it seem like a Saturday morning cartoon where the villain
yes.
is like a mustache twirling, like,
No, really, but
Waluigi,
his
like,
whole the whole thing was like I looked up to Spider-Man as a hero, but he doesn't seem so cool to me now. And so then he just kind of essentially is attacking and he's lashing out at Being in a weird way where he's just like, he didn't like the way that he was before he was Electro, so his new identity being tied to the power that he has then just kind of becomes his motivating factor. So again, very adversarial, foolish spirit.
well, would you want to look blue like that?
Yeah, it's pretty unfair. So he's pretty happy in this one. He comes in and he's like, "I'm Jamie Foxx. This is sick." They play it out that way and it's hilarious. And then so of course, whenever Peter puts the thing on his chest here, he's like, I'm not about that. I don't feel very good about this.
He doesn't want to go back to being a loser.
And I think he explicitly says, I don't want to be who I was. And so that dissension from the foolish adversary precedes the actual adversarial spirit, right? And so then Peter
Very
Spider
next
sense,
scene.
it's literally like shot to shot.
Yeah.
Immediately after he says that, right, Peter's spider sense starts going off, and it's really cool actually. I like that scene. It really ratchets the tension up because it's telling you like it's about to get serious, right? Like that guy, his whole like I don't feel good about this. That's nothing, and Peter's like, what is going on? He's walking around the apartment. Something's wrong because he's about to administer his treatment to Goblin, right? Now, it is interesting to me what happens here. So Peter is going to now administer the treatment to Goblin. Goblin is not going to have it. So Peter anticipates that that's what happens. And then he webs Goblin's hand before he can do anything. And then Goblin reveals himself to be ultimately in control this whole time. Right? And he's basically, I was watching you through the eyes of Norman.
It's like Gollum, though.
Yeah.
It's so like Gollum.
It's very much that thing, right? It
Doesn't he say, though, like, he comments about the spider sense?
He's like, he comments that it's inconvenient, right?
Yeah.
I can't remember how he says it. He's like, that cursed Spidey sense.
But he's way stronger than Spider-Man.
But I think that's to say that that spider sense is also very representative of that intuition that you have as to what's right or wrong.
Yes.
And
But only when one is on the path, because let's say in the second movie, when does Peter lose his spider sense, right? When he goes off the path, when he
Right.
rejects his responsibility. And it's like part of that.
Right, and so and that's the thing. It's like it's similar to like the Nimbus and Dragon Ball, where it elevates your senses. It makes you more capable of being able to see what's happening around you, to perceive what's actually happening in a more cosmic
and
sense.
Dragon Ball literally elevates you.
Yeah, it elevates your sight, right?
But right, and so Goblin reveals himself, and they have a battle.
And-
It's Octavius versus Electro, and Peter takes
I believe so.
on Goblin,
yeah.
right? Yeah.
And at this point, I want to point out Lizard is not here. He decided that he wanted to stay in the van outside.
Which is so weird for Dr. Connors' character.
Yeah,
the
like
Amazing movies are weird.
Like wouldn't
Is that how he is in the movie?
Yeah, he's a scientist that's wants to be a lizard, and so he lizards.
And so he's in the truck.
He thinks
We'll
it's the
just
next
mention
step of
that.
evolution. Basically.
Additionally,
He worships his own invention, right? So he makes something that can turn people into lizards because he thinks that because he made it, it's the next step of evolution. He thinks it should happen to everybody else, and so it's that Luciferian worship of his own intellect. Blah blah blah
Yes.
blah. He's just another version of it, right?
But at the same time, Dr. Connors typically, once he's reverted, I don't know, maybe I guess he's still crazy.
Well, Connor's like made himself into a lizard, and he gets
It
reverted.
just
back
seems
into,
weird that he doesn't help at all.
No, yeah, well, he gets reverted back into a dude that would turn himself back into a lizard if he could. So like,
I know.
so like my interpretation of the resolution of his story, we'll get to it, but his presence here is a joke, and it's a hilarious joke because right at that moment, as Peter's sensing it, someone else is sensing that something's going on, right?
Well,
So
before we
down
get
there,
there,
down.
hold
Well, I
on.
want to say Lizard though.
No,
Lizard is
before that,
okay.
let me say this.
Okay.
J.K. Simmons' character, JJ, has found out that Spider-Man is here in this apartment, so he's filming down there. I just want to make
Yeah.
that clear right now,
Right. Well,
so that
so
we can set up that.
I was going to say that, but before we even get to that, I do want to point out that Lizard senses also that something's about to happen whenever J.K. Simmons pulls up.
Yeah.
So it's like all these things happen simultaneously. So it's like Peter senses something's going to happen. Boom, they pull up, and then it just so happens that down here, Lizard senses something's going to happen too. And so Lizard's presence here as sort of a symbol to represent what's happening in the cosmic story of Peter Parker's life, is aware of his opportunity in this situation. And so everything kicks off, right? The fight breaks out. First of all, Goblin is just kicking the shit out of Tom Holland Spider-Man, as he should.
Tom
like
Holland Spider-Man.
Tom Holland Spider-Man is like, oh my
messed up.
god, I've never experienced malice like this before.
Definitely.
And he's punching him in the face, and he's just laughing at him, and he's got this wicked grin, and it's like perfect. Willem Dafoe's depiction of Goblin is like,
Oh, it's God.
it's like Heath Ledger's Joker, right?
Yeah, it's the only one.
Maybe
I'll
more
accept.
iconic at this
Yeah,
point.
could be.
But it was this perfect expression of him, because Peter's trying all of these things, right? So as like a spider, like he's smaller than he is, and he's up on him, and he's trying to strike him. So what does Goblin do? He just suplexes him through the floor.
Yeah.
He just crushes him with his
power
weight.
bombs him,
Yeah, power bombs him straight down through the floor,
Yes.
and really messes him up.
Yeah.
Now,
Peter gets beat.
Electro grabs Tony Stark's arc reactor, powers himself with it, and blasts Dr. Octavius out of the building. It's like Pilaf getting the Dragon Balls. He's the foolish adversary that he's seen this orb of power, right? And so he grabs it for himself, and then he gets to enact his false power, right?
Mhm.
The electricity that comes from him. It's like he points at things and they happen because of his arbitrary power he has. And so he keeps doing that foolish adversary thing, and he forces out Octavius, like forces him out of the window. Octavius just like books it. At this point, on the ground, we have J.K. Simmons as J. Jonah Jameson filming, and he sees Octavius like crawling on the building, and at one point I think he sees Peter like land on the outside of the building
He's
and crawl
like,
around.
this is all the responsibility of Spider-Man.
And while all the cameras are looking
guess
that
what?
way,
Just like Alex Jones, it's
Lizard
true.
bursts out of the van and runs past him, and all the cameras are pointed up at like Octavius and Spider-Man where the fight's happening, and J. Jonah Jameson turns around and sees Lizard go running by, and he says, "Anybody else see that?" And
It's just perfect. The
it's
lizard
the funniest
people.
part of the movie.
Alex Jones sees lizard people in Spider-Man.
Like
Best.
the mimetic consciousness
Oh,
of
it's so good.
Spider-Man is,
Well, don't forget
That's
the meme
great.
of them
It's so
pointing at
funny.
themselves is about to come up too.
yes, they do get that scene in there too. So yeah, the scene essentially
Ends in the bottom floor where Peter is still fighting Goblin, and
yeah.
May has managed to get to him with the cure.
So because Peter was not able to cure him, he tells May to run immediately when he senses what's about to happen. So he knows what he needs to do is to protect May from Goblin. And why do you think he would intuit that? Without knowing, let's say necessarily.
Well, he does know now. He's fought Goblin. He knows the malice that he's dealing with, and he understands that May is not going to be able to withstand it.
Well, that's the thing, right? Because I think one of the first things he says is I don't know if she's the first person he brings up when he amends a spell, but he states that it was hard on Aunt May when she found out that he was Spider-Man. So it's extremely hard on Aunt May whenever her pet, Osborn, right, his mask comes off and it's revealed who he is, right?
Mhm.
I think it's sort of like that. And so he's trying to protect her because just in seeing
I see
that
what you
the
mean,
malice is
Well,
there,
protect her faith, yeah.
it would destroy her faith, right? That the malice is inside of that. So he tells her to run away and tries to protect her from what he inevitably is going to do, right? And so they make it down to the ground floor of the building, which is now on fire and is rubble everywhere from essentially Goblin repeatedly crushing him down the hierarchy, literally level by level,
Bringing him down to Goblin's level,
and
literally.
and now destroying his faith, right?
Yes.
Because they have a fight at the bottom, and Aunt May runs up and hits him with the serum, stabs it into his neck, right? And he sits there for a second, and then he says, "Didn't work." Why
Yeah.
Why do you think it didn't work?
Well, we kind of talked about this before, right? That it can't be the the natural course to
Yeah.
cure the malice in the world, right? Mother Nature can't cure malice in the world. It's not natural for that to happen.
Well, at this
It can
point,
only be
too,
redeemed, right, by the hero, which is what Peter has to do. So he has to administer the serum, not Aunt May.
and that's why I wanted to point out earlier. It's originally Peter was going to do it, and that's why he stopped him, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Now, logically, this isn't a different serum, but it is. It matters.
So it's not
the serum.
again. It could be conceived of as a plot hole because
Right.
it should be the same serum, but
Well, not necessarily the same because we didn't know if it would work, but the intonation though is there, right? That
and we'll get to that too. We still have a lot to go.
well, so it's really interesting though because we have to do the final step for Peter here in this situation. So Goblin essentially summons his glider down here at the bottom floor, and he makes a joke apology to Peter, which I think is perfectly fitting, right?
For Goblin, yeah.
For Goblin,
It's
right?
the exploitation again, and
to diminish
this
the
is how he
gravitas,
tried to
right?
kill Spider-Man in the first movie.
That it
to
was a
trick
joke,
him
right?
That way.
He's very Joker-like in that sense.
Yes.
And so he makes a joke about it. The glider flies in and rams into Aunt May, which at that point I was like, he killed her.
Yeah, I also thought that.
And then he lands on the glider, pulls out a pumpkin bomb, then throws that at her. So Peter jumps in front of the bomb, it blows up, blowing off his mask.
Yeah, he knocks it so it doesn't kill May, like it doesn't
Right.
disintegrate her.
Right, but it blows up and damages his suit
His
significantly.
suit. I was gonna correct you from mask to say
Yeah.
suit.
Not just mask,
Because
but yeah.
and it's beautiful how it works because by killing Aunt May, he has irreparably damaged that part of
The suit that she
Spider-Man.
just cleaned for him, right?
Yeah.
And so it's
Well, the suit of Homecoming too. It's not
Right.
just the suit that
the suit of home.
Yes.
Yes.
It's No Way Home.
There's no way
Oh
home.
man, the movie's so good.
And so that suit is now destroyed. So
Yes.
like so when that happens, it destroys Peter, right? Because this is that ego death type situation for him where his identity symbolized in his suit is actually damaged or destroyed. And he's leveled down, so he's brought low, right? Literally brought low down to the floor level again. And at this moment, Happy pulls up and he sees and he just knows what's going on because that's how it works. And then the police shoot Peter.
That doesn't happen right after that? Yeah.
Yup. They just march in and they're like, "Put your hands up." And he's like, Aunt May
Bang, bang.
has died here in front of me,
Yes.
right? Because they play it weird. I guess I got a little ahead of myself. They play it so
it's
weird,
so
though.
dumb. They should have just done it instantly, like where she was on the ground. Because she gets up, she acts like she's fine. They have
She has to have the line.
because she has to have the line.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is
But the line
one,
is less. This is a big complaint.
yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, this is that instance of like monologuing, like if you have to say it, right? And so she has to stand up. She literally gets back up whenever she's been killed, basically, to monologue to Peter
As a ghost.
that with great power comes great responsibility.
Yes. But it's less impactful because Peter was doing the right thing.
Yeah.
in
This
the
like this isn't necessarily Peter's fault.
yeah, it's not Peter's fault that there's malice he has not yet encountered and hasn't come to
Right,
grips
because
with.
he did what she advised him to do here
Well,
when he
and he
didn't
did
want
the
to
thing. He
originally,
did the thing he needed to do to
which
redeem his mistake.
which was to take responsibility, right?
Right, which that's why it just doesn't land the same way as the classic story
Yeah.
where it's Ben that tells him that, and then he refuses responsibility, and it ends up killing him.
And his refusal of the responsibility leads to that.
It's not like Peter's like, "I'm not gonna cure you, Osborn."
And then Osborn gets mad and kills Aunt May for it or something.
Yeah, it's not that. It's
Because that would have actually made sense. Like, let's say that Osborn is Osborn, gets turned away by Peter, escapes, and then curses Peter for not respecting his humanity, which gives Goblin an in to take control of him again, and then that happens. That would make thematic
so
sense
much
to
better.
me, right?
It makes so much better.
And so that's I think subconsciously I tried to just walk right over that fact to the next thing that was significant in the story.
Well,
instead.
because I brought it up to you
Yeah.
after I saw it. That was
Yes.
one of my biggest complaints. Of
Yeah, I think you're right. You're totally right about that. And that's why that's one of the sticking points for fans, I think. It just doesn't like land that well. I don't think some of the structure of this movie is very convenient, okay? So at this point in the movie, now Peter is devastated. And so he's like shattered by this thing that's happened where she has stood back up. She's told him with great power comes great responsibility. Then she dies, and then he's like, okay. Now
and
this
then the police shoot him.
the police shoot him, and then by the next time we see him, he's like, yeah, I'm going to kill, right? So maybe...
I'm gonna kill.
So if I'm going to take it in that context, if they were trying to justify the nihilistic skew that he has the next time we see him where he wants to kill Goblin, maybe it's justified, right? That it would be an unfair thing rather than a fair thing to do with this character. Because that is what Goblin would do, is to take a fair situation and make it unfair towards him so that he would lose his faith in the fairness of being. So charitable interpretation is that that's what's happening. That it it's necessarily absurd.
not his fault.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was doing the right thing, and because of that, it still didn't work out for him. But then the line doesn't make sense.
But then the line doesn't really fit within
Yeah, exactly.
the context. So she should have just died.
Just die, please die.
So
she dies.
So she dies, and Peter disappears, and everyone is sort of left out in the wind. Sort of, they don't know what to do. Peter has left the box with MJ and Ned, and they don't know what to do. They're like, should I hit this button? Where's Peter? What's going on? He hasn't sent us the signal, right? And so they're having faith in him in the same way that you remember we were recently talking about Dragon Ball, waiting for Goku in the submarine. It's like you don't just bail out of the situation. You wait for the heroic thing to arise. And so they're waiting on Peter to push the button on the lamp to undo the spell, right? And let me see how this is laid out so I make sure I'm not skipping over anything.
They use the portals to try and call him.
Right.
They figure out that
yeah. Okay.
Ned has
so it goes immediately into that
power.
scene. Yeah. So Ned, who I'll point this out retroactively, but Ned has specifically talked to Doctor Strange and expressed that his mother told him that he is magical and that he has dreams and he gets tinglings in his hands. And as a joke, Doctor Strange tells him you should see a physician, right? Or see a doctor about that. Now Ned idolizes Doctor Strange, and whenever Peter defeats Doctor Strange in their battle, he takes his rings and he gives them to Ned. Now this is very standard archetypal trio type stuff, right? So you've always got the hero, you've got the hero sidekick, his expression of himself, the Krillin to Goku or whatever, right? The whatever it is, and then you've got the feminine archetype, right? Like the expression, feminine wise. So like an anima representation or whatever it is. So whenever I almost called him Goku just because of my analogy. Whenever Peter defeats Doctor Strange, he takes his expression of his ability to do magic, right? And he gives it to Ned, his like sort of uh his foolish, childish expression, right? And so it's interesting then that now that Ned has that,
Well,
right?
it's because he's
He
foolish that
can
it happens to work, right?
right. He so because of that, then Ned later he's trying to find he's not even trying to find Peter. He's talking with his hands, he's gesturing, and they see that with his words as he's talking,
It
magic appears,
manifests, yeah.
right? So then she says, "Do that again." So he says essentially something along the lines of like, "I wish we could just see him," right? And he's waving his hand, and then he manages to get the portal to start sparking again. So then he imitates Doctor Strange, and he says, "I wish we could see him." And he does the motion, and it opens a portal, and we see what appears to be
Spider-Man.
Peter Parker.
Yeah.
As far as they know, that is Peter Parker that they know because they're Spider-Man. However, the Peter Parker that comes in is not the same
Andrew
Peter Parker,
Garfield.
but it is Spider-Man, right?
Yes.
And so that multiplicity of identity now
Is
starts
very
colliding,
apparent,
right?
yeah.
Because it turns out that it wasn't just malevolent spirits that were being brought in, but that also there are some benevolent ones.
There is the white dot in the
Mhm.
black paisley still.
Right.
The wisdom to be gained by confronting chaos, which we'll see at the top of the school in just a moment.
Right. So they bring in Andrew Garfield's Peter Parker and play a nice little gag where they won't believe that he's Spider-Man, and MJ's takes a lot of convincing to believe that he's actually another Peter Parker, right?
For some reason.
For whatever reason.
It's a gag.
It's a nice little gag scene.
So then they try again.
So they try to imagine Peter again, and this time he comes in and he's even older. And now it's Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man, right? And he's much more reserved, and he's just like, "Yeah, I'm Spider-Man." And then they shoots a web at.
Well, I want to say that he comes in dressed as Peter Parker.
Yeah, he comes in as Peter, not as Spider-Man, right?
Yeah.
And
he shoots a web.
he shoots a web to prove himself because his spider sense tingles at the same time as the other Spider-Man, it seems, and they both react to a fake Spider-Man being in the same room, right? So he proves himself just by his mode of being, right, instead of having to do a bunch of theatrics as Spider-Man, right? So it's kind of funny
because that's exactly
because he has organic web slingers.
Well, I was gonna say that's how it is in the movies, right? That he is organically Spider-Man, whereas Andrew Garfield was only Spider-Man through a bunch of theatrics.
Yes. And so I think that's the meta commentary that the movie's making, which is like, oh, you're Spider-Man, do the thing, right? And Peter Parker comes in, and he's like, he's obviously
Tobey,
Spider-Man. And when Tobey comes in, I mean,
yeah,
it's a lot. Names.
Yeah, I know it's a lot of names.
But yeah, I think that. But what I want to say about that is the perspective of that extrapolation of Peter Parker's youth and his innocence is trying then to magically summon an idea of what he is now that these things have happened. And when they try to imagine him and what he's gone through, he's more mature and he's older, right? And they try to imagine him again and he's even older. So it almost symbolically is playing out this thing because there's a separation between the two of them because now it's been forced on him, right? That he's aging out of their innocence, right? Because he feels culpable for what's happened to Aunt May because it was his decision. And so there's that divide between them. And so when they try to imagine him, it's not him anymore. He's categorically an older person, and he's the older version of Spider-Man that comes.
And so that's why when they call upon him, they can't find him.
They find a different person because to them Peter Parker is a different person.
Well,
now,
and think
right?
too, what is Andrew Garfield's main growth in this movie is that he redeems himself for killing Gwen.
Yes.
And so that's part of it too, is that the whole redemption arc, which is what Peter's on now, right, is the first thing they summon. And the second thing they summon is
the spiritual father. Right?
Basically, yeah.
The spiritual Spider-Man, the
Spider-Man.
The Spider-Man that is and doesn't have to act it out to prove itself as Spider-Man.
Exactly, yes. That's a perfect way to put it. So, they meet all the other spiders, and then they do find Peter on top of the school.
So they discuss how are we going to find the real Peter, And
Then MJ's like, I know where he is.
so they talk about their comforting places, right? And the other
The
Spider-Man,
other spider.
the other
The other
spiders,
spider with a human face.
yeah, the other spiders say one likes the Empire State Building, right? And I can't remember the other one, but they're talking, they're Batman-like in their attitudes, though, right? They overlook the city, and that's their place of comfort. But MJ knows where Peter's place of comfort is, which is back at school, right? He just wants to be a kid still. You know, he wants to remain
He's
innocent,
comforted by the innocence of the past. Yeah.
right? And that's what this movie's
And the
whole
times that he's looking backwards there, because that's when he was in schools, whenever he met Tony,
yeah,
whenever he became an Avenger, and now he's trying to go off to college, and he has to dissociate himself with those things to become his own person.
exactly. Yeah, he needs to stop being a puppet and be a
Not
real
a
boy.
marionette, the Iron Man marionette, right?
And so he really wants to hang on to that. He wants to be
And so he goes back
a
to the
puppet.
school.
He wants to be part of a machine. He wants to be part of a mechanism and still be engaged in an identity that's given to him, And so he is on top of the school, and Ned and MJ come to him with the two other Peters.
The two Spider-Mans.
They essentially start monologuing to him about, not necessarily monologuing, but basically saying, I know what you've been through.
He's like, don't tell me what you
He's like, I can't listen to what you have to say because what I'm going through is
unique
the worst
to me.
Right. And so as he has, been confronted with what inevitably could come from his resentment, right? He starts finding the way again. And so I like that he's able to come together with them and find a place where he can find a path.
Well, and
forward.
it's because it's the genuine aspect. Andrew Garfield starts talking to him, and he's one that literally knows that it's his fault for killing Gwen, and that's his big growth, like I was saying. So on that relation, Peter rejects that, and he's like, well, Tom Holland rejects that, and he says that you don't know what I've been through, but he actually does, and he doesn't challenge him on it. He just accepts it. But later on, Tom Holland Spider-Man reveals that Aunt May said the responsibility line, and both the other Peter Parkers know that, and that's because that line and that philosoph, let's say, is part of what makes Spider-Man, and he's not Spider-Man without that ethic. And so when they discuss that, and that's when they truly realize that they are all alike, and they all represent that same heroic spirit that Spider-Man is, and they realize that Spider-Man is bigger than all of them, and so that they can collaborate then and find that path that Brock was talking about, to travel on, that would further the mode of being that they're all adopting in their respective universes. And so at that point, I think even though Tom Holland's Spider-Man is still quite resentful and harbors a lot of ill will and almost villainousness towards Goblin specifically, he is able to come onto a path where he can at least resume his attempt at redeeming the spirits which have entered into his universe.
There's definitely a squaring, and you look forward at, and I'm not sure if this is what you just said as I stepped out real quick, but you look forward at the path you could take, right? Your own potentiality. Whenever you look inward, you look then at your own, you frame the path that you're on or the story that you're living out, right? And so having that contextualized in a moment whenever you truly would need it, right, is something that reveals itself through essentially Peter seeing that he needs to look inward to then determine what that orientation is going to be, what the path is. And so the context of his future tells him he can look into his past to choose what the right thing is to do and move forward for himself without having to lean
But
on
it's not even
his friends.
It's not his past. It's a respect for the spirit of the hero, which Spider-Man represents.
Yeah, the goodness within the patterns in his past, right? You could say.
Well, and I want to say Spider-Man specifically because Into the Spider-Verse has even more iterations of Spider-Man, right? That are
Right.
all instantiations of that spirit. Even though it's that movie maybe we'll talk about someday.
But I think immediately following also this conversation, I think they go into the high school, right? And they start working on
That's
making
when
the
they work
cures,
for the
right?
cures. Yep,
And so I think that that's what this is because, and they have
it's
a
the
little group
path.
therapy
Well,
session too.
what I was saying is that they realized that the philosophy and ethic of Spider-Man is above all the individual Peter Parkers when they
Right.
all realize that the
What's common
responsibility
about Spider-Man?
and that's from the line, right? What's
Yeah.
great with great power comes great responsibility. And so they all whenever that is revealed and they each say a piece of it, right? It's kind of uttering that a spell
Hmm.
of their own that reintegrates Spider-Man and allows him to
Well,
take that path.
it's interesting that they do it by trying to condense what Spider-Man is into the shortest little line they can, which is got to say the line.
It's true. It's a
So they're
corporate thing that actually fits, which
well, they're
is
weaving a concise spell, right?
yeah.
In a sense, because they're like, what's missing from this iteration of Spider-Man? The responsibility. And of course, in his character leading up to this, that responsibility has been missing. So that would be the spell, right? That would be the words that
Right.
would tie it all together and make
And
order
as
out
we
of it.
said, it doesn't fit very well in how they did it with the actual wording, but with Toby and Andrew both saying it and
Mhm.
agreeing and like being enlightened by it in the scene on top of the school kind of redeems that. It makes it to where I can overlook their sloppy handling
Well, I
of
think
how
of
it's
it
spoken.
symbolically like this is that dark night of the soul where he is asking himself what makes a man or what makes a Spider-Man, right? And he extrapolates out a version of himself in the
Right.
future that's
What
gone
makes
through
a
this type of guilt
Spider-Man this?
and asks himself what is it that would keep the identity of Spider-Man true.
Well, see, and that's the thing. And that's why I understand why the filmmakers went for what they went for with Aunt May's death.
Hmm.
Like we already addressed, it's almost like a now Toby and Andrew are like, okay, now you can actually be Spider-Man.
Right. Well, I mean, and there's it rings true in a different sort of way than the Uncle Ben does with that passing into or passing out of innocence, right? Where you can think of even shamanic rituals where they would ritually separate the child from the mother and say, "Now you are a man. You're separated from the family identity," right? And so it plays out that way here for him being separated from this sort of mother archetype figure for him, right? Um, but the big question being is is the resentment worth it towards the nature of the being in which that spirit would be treated in that way, right? Or that it could be destroyed at all, right? And so we have this situation here where the solution has to come from within Spider-Man, and the way that they represent from within Spider-Man
Is
is
by
with more
Spider-Man.
Spider-Man.
Yes.
I like that. I like how it plays out, and I think that's why we have that little group therapy session and why we have the meme of them all pointing at each other in this
Yes.
scene, right?
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. And that
Because
meme we were talking about earlier.
when they're in the lab, they have their discussions about just various things. It's mainly fan service. Like they have a conversation with Toby's character about his webs, and they
Yes.
ask him, "So that just like comes out of you, like
Do any
really?"
web blocks? Yeah. And he's like, yeah, I
And
had one web block. He talks about how in Spider-Man 2, right, he lost his powers,
right,
all that. It is a lot of fan service, but also when like I think it's Net, I can't remember if it's Ned or MJ. They call out for Peter, and they're like
yeah,
Peter, and they like point at each other. They literally do the meme. Um, but right, so they eventually are able to develop these cures, and particularly Andrew Garfield comes up with the cure for the lizard, saying he already knows how to do it,
yep.
and Electro because does he also no
No,
Electro's cure is already made.
Peter. Sorry,
Tom Holland,
Tom Holland Peter has already created the cure for Electro.
right?
But the thing is, they improve it here by working together so that it works better than it did before because it
Right,
took a
doesn't
long
have the
time
charge
before.
up time.
Yeah.
And so that's
But I think
one
the
thing,
familiarity that the other Peter has symbolically makes it so that he
but
can
it is
extract what motivates him like that.
it's the Toby Maguire Peter
Yeah.
It's really important because he says, "I'll come up with the serum for Norman
And then he says he's been thinking about it.
for a long time."
Yeah.
And that's to say that he understands that the actions taken in that first Spider-Man movie could have been avoided, and there was more he could have done, and so he has that guilt that he's trying to absolve as well, because that's the real thing that propels the story of
That's what
Spider-Man
destroys his
3 and
friend, right?
destroys his friendship. It makes him it kills his best friend, right?
Mm-hmm.
And all that.
Ruins his relationship with MJ. I mean, there's so many things about it that
Yeah.
could have been reconciled differently if only, it didn't play out the way that it did.
And so he offers to do that, and he's able to do that because of his experience. the sorry. The Tobey Maguire Peter that they summon back is one that exists after the events of Spider-Man 3, just as a mention.
Yeah, there's no real continuity as to when they come in. Earlier, they
But we
had
know
their
it has to be
conversation.
after Spider-Man 3.
Well, I thought that this was going to go a different way. Also, it's might be a weird time to bring it up, but whenever they said they had their conversation, they were saying the last thing that they remembered was before they died fighting Spider-Man. I thought there was going to be an ethical dilemma in this where Tom Holland's Spider-Man had to think about whether or not he considered himself to be worthy of condemning someone to death by his hypothetical own hand, right? And so I thought it was going to go that direction, and that would have made it like formulaic, I guess, in a sense, right? Where it's like, oh, his Dark Knight of the Soul is whether or not he should be a hero, and then we have Spider-Man 3. But instead, it doesn't go the Spider-Man 3 route.
Right.
And then instead, he tries to take responsibility. So just that little bit there, I like how it was handled. It just shows, it goes further to show that they get the spirit of what Spider-Man should really be about.
And so then they go to the Statue of Liberty to fight all of the villains.
So at this point, they haven't caught back up with Octavius at all. They don't know what he's up to. Presumably, his chip just got refried. He's refried beans at this point, and he's off the reservation. So don't even worry about him. They're like, okay, we just got to make sure that we disable these other villains, and essentially, put them back in order. Take them out of the chaos and put them where they're supposed to be within this sort of cosmic framing. And I say cosmic because it really is a cosmic framing. This whole situation being precipitated by Doctor Strange and his cosmic act, right?
And his cosmic act, on top. Well, we'll get there.
But so they go specifically to the Statue of Liberty, which we see is holding up a big Avengers shield, and Peter calls in as Spider-Man. Spider-Man calls in to the Alex Jones show. He calls into InfoWars, and he has a conversation with Alex Jones and says that, yep, this is what's going on. I have some responsibility for the way that things have gone. I definitely could have done better. And if any of you out there have any faith in Spider-Man, then I can use your faith. And I think that's really succinct. I think that's basically Goku calling out for the support for the Spirit Bomb, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And it's also an act of responsibility, right? And a humbling of himself where he calls to his biggest detractor and somebody who's tried to destroy his life and who has enriched himself through destroying his life, we've seen, still admits his wrongdoings to that person. And that's a real squaring of the J. Jonah Jameson dichotomy, right? And another example of squaring a father-type figure, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's so interesting that in so many ways this film tries to do that, where it's like having a scene, you wouldn't really think of it as being significant, but having a scene where Spider-Man's calling and talking directly to J. Jonah Jameson and telling him, validating part of his disagreements with him, right? Like, what is that other than that?
Right. What is it other than hoisting his petard, right?
Holding up his responsibility or hoisting up the cross.
Yeah, carrying his cross.
Yep.
And so they manage to, after they're joined with Octavius, they're managed to defeat and cure Connors and Dylan and Marco. Not before, though, one thing I do want to mention is that the Lizard runs into the portal made by MJ and Ned.
Well, made by Ned, and interestingly, the reason that he's able to during this fight is that I believe Ned is not able to close the portal. Right? I believe that's because, well, symbolically, you can say he and MJ would never make the decision not to be friends with Peter.
Right.
They're
They
always
can't cut off their
they
connection.
love Peter, right?
Mm-hmm.
There would be no reason for them to abandon him, and they've told him in this film that they want to be a part of his life and they want to help him with his superhero stuff, even though it's really confusing to him whenever he tries to replace the voice in his head with their voices. And they they want to continue to try to help Peter because they admire him and they are good, and that innocence drives them to strive towards that good, right? But what Peter has to be able to square is that as long as they have this association with a muddled identity like his, it'll always corrupt their paradise. It will always essentially make it so that they can't have order. And so that's represented here with the snake getting into the garden, with the garden being Peter's science lab, right? And occupied by his childhood friends. That innocence that he's trying to hang on to.
Yes.
And
exactly.
so they can't close the portal, and the snake gets in, and Peter has to swoop in and rescue them from that situation again. And that's when the realization starts to come to him what has to be done to fix all of this, I think.
Yes. And that is, I think, almost when he decides, like, all right. Because I think, is it? Oh, it's just after this. Okay. Because they try to get back in there, right? And that's how they free Doctor Strange.
Mm-hmm.
So, they have a lengthy battle with Electro, and they reconcile the universe of Spider-Man, and he is encouraged to abandon his villainous tendencies as he puts on the thing, and he's uncharged, and he's kind of a little bit sad about it, but he's not like, I'm gonna kill you all. You took away my powers or anything like that.
He instead voices his disappointment in seeing that Tom Holland's not black.
Oh yeah.
He says, you're from New York and you're pretty cool and you help out the poor and do all these things.
Just thought you'd be black.
Just thought you'd be black. And then Andrew Garfield's, sorry, I think I said Tom Holland, but Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, I'm sorry. But it's funny because this is the movie acknowledging that they broke the rules because he didn't know who Peter Parker was.
Right. I know. Again, I know.
So it's a funny, weird thing that they did. I think they could have handled it a little bit better. But, so we see one of those little reconciliations, which is weird, but...
And meanwhile, Ned tries to get back to the science lab using the ring, and he accidentally frees Doctor Strange.
Right.
And so Doctor Strange comes in, and he is determined to fix this no matter the cost, meaning he'll send them back to their times where they died of Spider-Man. He doesn't really care at this point.
It's interesting that he listens at all to Ned and MJ whenever they tell him that Peter's actually fixing things on his own and not to send him back.
Mm-hmm.
Because he can't imagine that Peter would be able to square for this long the infinite sins of a hypothetical Superman or Spider-Man.
Yeah.
Right? Because that's what he's doing. He's bearing the burden of all hypothetical outcomes.
All Spider-Man, yes.
Yeah, of Spider-Man as such. Like, this is literally Tom Holland having to hoist up the mantle of the Spider-Man cinematic representation. Right?
Yes. And so he gets above the Statue of Liberty just as the sun is coming up and begins to cast his spell that will make everyone forget Spider-Man.
But this time it is at Spider-Man, meaning Tom Holland Spider-Man's behest.
Yes.
That he make everybody forget. Now, I do want to point out, before this really kicks off, we also have Octavius comes back into the fray and
to defeat Dylan,
and saves all of the Spider-Men, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's
because they're losing to Electro pretty badly.
Yeah, Electro's on a Stark reactor, right?
Yeah, he's insanely
and
powerful.
So wielding that power that was hidden away in Happy's apartment, right, as sort of a last physical remnant of Tony Stark's, power itself. That's the only thing that lets the foolish adversary have as much power as he does here, right? And so because of that, though, I like that it doesn't defeat Doc Ock, right? Like Doc Ock is able to overcome him the way that he does, and the electricity doesn't just like destroy his arms or fry his arms, right?
Yeah.
Because, I mean, this is a redeemed.
Alfred Molina.
Well, yeah, he's a redeemed technical father figure. I mean,
Yeah.
this is a joke, right? And so, in that sense, right, it has to be him earlier also because, as we had said earlier, the foolish adversary precedes the real adversary.
Yes. And so then after actually it doesn't happen yet that he tells him to make everyone forget. That happens in a minute.
Right.
Before that, it's just Doctor Strange trying to control and keep like the fabric of the universe from splitting.
Right. He's just kind of hovering up there trying to correct all the
right
anomalies.
Peter wants to go up there, but before he can, he has to fight Goblin. And that's for that exact reason. He can't do this until he has redeemed the spirit of
he's
the
not
Father.
yet ready to hoist up that full responsibility, right?
And so an enraged Peter, Tom Holland, fights and overpowers the Goblin, and he intends to kill him using his own glider, but he's stopped by Tobey Maguire's Peter.
Which he pays for by being stabbed by Goblin. Now, I really like the way that this plays out in a couple of different ways. The first way is we have a line earlier in the movie where whenever he goes to the Statue of Liberty, J. Jonah Jameson is like, why is he always destroying national monuments?
Yes.
It's like we're going to destroy another national monument, right? And we see that the Statue of Liberty has been changed to be holding an Avengers shield instead of the torch, right? And I think that that's wrong.
Yes.
Right? Because that's overly maternal.
Well,
to always be shielding instead of holding the torch to light
I
people's
disagree.
ways,
I don't think that's why it's wrong.
Okay, so the reason that I want to say that, right, is because of Peter's desire to remain in that paradisa and to try to keep the status quo and to try to keep protecting what he has to mature out of, right? Then we see a manifestation of that in the Statue of Liberty holding a shield instead of holding the torch, right, which guides the way that is to redemption, to
I do like
individual sovereignty rather than your paradise, right?
I do like your analysis of the torch versus the shield in that way, but what I was thinking is that it is the deification and glorification of a certain ego, right? Whereas the heroic spirit is supposed to do it without monuments. There shouldn't be monuments to Superman.
It's like a mask. It's like a suit for the Statue of Liberty, right?
And so it's literally antithetical to what Peter is trying to become in this movie,
which is an individual,
which is why he has to tear that down.
Exactly.
And so they end up fighting at the bottom, but I want to touch back on that. Tobey Maguire stopping Tom Holland's Peter Parker from killing Goblin.
I think that maybe that analysis earlier might be right in the unfairness of what's been presented with him and why that malice could manifest in Tom Holland, because it is to kill is to denounce being, right? And so in his act, he's symbolically,
to say there's nothing redeemable about this mode of being, right?
Yeah, there is nothing to be redeemed, right? But it's definitely
better to be killed.
Yeah, better if you never were, right?
Right. And so and something too, because when Peter Parker I always have to be
I know, right?
When Tobey Maguire tells his Aunt May that he killed Uncle Ben's, or he was responsible for Uncle Ben's murder, basically.
I think he says Spider-Man killed him, and she says something along the lines of like Spider-Man doesn't kill or something, right? Or am I thinking of a different conversation?
You might be right.
But
it's something like that.
But Aunt May says, defines it as Spider-Man doesn't kill, though, right?
Yeah, and then he asks her, I'd have to rewatch the movie, but then he asks her, I think, did he deserve to die?
Mm-hmm.
and she basically says that it's not. I think she says it's not her place.
It's not
to
her place to
judge
judge. Yeah.
if someone is irredeemable.
And that is the wisdom that he needs to gain from Aunt May, which is so sloppily handed over in a way.
Exactly, but not his Aunt May, because his Aunt
Yeah.
May wouldn't be able to convey that. But it's from Tobey Maguire's Aunt
Right.
May, and that's why it has to be Tobey that stops him, because
Because he didn't learn
Andrew
it.
Garfield didn't have that experience.
Right. No, and then on another level, like there's the other weird meta level that it lines up is they're all standing on this giant Captain America shield,
Mhm.
like halfway submerged in the water, where if you recall back in Civil War, the movie that introduced Peter Parker, in that scene, Captain America takes his shield and he brings it up over his head and he strikes it down in intention to kill Tony Stark, right? And so Peter has to literally not act out the killing of his spiritual father in that
Well,
sense.
no, he doesn't. He's not to kill Tony. Like, that's not to kill
Not to kill Tony, but the shadow, calling him like a shadow of Tony, right?
But
That there's a
see, I don't know,
redeemable
'cause
aspect of the
Civil
father.
War, so I don't think Captain America was ever trying to kill Tony, and that's what made
No, I don't
him-
think he was trying to kill Tony, right?
That's
but
why
like,
he wins.
But
that.
that gesture was used to attack at the heart of.
Oh, I see what you're
because
saying.
that moment in that movie is very much like he lifts it up like that and then he shows him mercy, right? But like the whole act of malice in that sense, and then it was shown towards Tony before is like, it seems like it is even more self-aware, right?
Right. And so then Tom Holland, no, who is it? Andrew Garfield throws the cure to Tom Holland.
Yeah.
And Tom Holland finally administers it to Goblin, restoring him to Norman Osborn.
And everything is pretty much set right, but the spell is still pulling more more.
Yeah, the spell cannot be contained, and we see like Rhino and some others.
You see Scorpion.
You see Scorpion, yeah.
There's a lot of different ones. Who's the hunter? What's his name? Something. Craven, yeah, Craven the hunter. You see him. There's.
They show Morbius. I don't know.
I'm not positive, but there's a lot of different silhouettes, and so now the sun has risen. The torch is being held by the Statue of Liberty. The Enlightenment has come, right? And so Peter goes up to Doctor Strange and tells him that he's ready to take on the responsibility of the spell that he asked for originally, right? And now he is willing to be forgotten by everybody.
He has now redeemed the spirit of the Father and understands the wisdom that's necessary for him to continue his life. And so he goes up to Doctor Strange after seeing MJ and having their love scene, and then he goes up and actually I think he goes to say his goodbyes after.
Yeah, well this time he goes up to Ned and MJ and he tells them just straight up what's about to happen. So an inversion of what he did before, where he didn't tell he didn't tell them that he was going to change people's memories and then went to go do it. They said, "Please include us." He tried including them, it didn't work, and now he's learned his lesson, which is that
to make the decision on his
he
own.
has to make it his own decision, right?
And so he tells Doctor Strange, "Make them all forget me."
And so he tells them forthrightly, "I made it my decision. I'm going to make it right." You know, tells them what they need to hear in the moment. And the spell resolves and everyone is sent back to their own dimensions. We got some funny moments between Andrew Garfield and Tobey Maguire where, they kind of joke back and forth, and Tobey Maguire's like, I've been stabbed before. And then they get sent back to their own realities. What any of this means in a logical sense, who knows? Like,
logically, whoa.
Like, all the timelines are completely destroyed. Who knows what's going to happen at this point? I think Spider-Man 3 didn't happen.
Pretty much.
There's so many different things.
Which should just erase Sandman from existence.
We didn't even talk about the resolution of Sandman because I don't know if there's much to say about.
He's here. Anyways, so
he's just there.
The spell goes through. Everyone's sent back to their universes, and our one and only Peter Parker, Tom Holland, is now back, and he goes to introduce himself to his old friends, but he's unable to do it because he understands now that even if he was to do this, it would present the same issues as before, and that his responsibility is to go forward and bear his cross forthrightly.
So he is rehearsing a speech to give to her whenever he is going to see her at her job. Now, how this spell worked, who knows? Like, there are so many things that need to be erased from reality for people not to know this that have known Peter intermittently. Like, so many different aspects of their lives don't make any sense anymore. Regardless of that logical sort of inconsistency, the situation is great because what Peter's trying to do is he's trying to cast another spell as he's walking up. And he's trying to articulate something that can summarize all of the sacrifices and different things that they made for him and that he made for them and that contextualized their relationship. And so that's why he's rehearsing it, because it's like that. He's trying to use his words to order it back in and make it make sense. And he just can't, because this is a lived thing. It can't be one-sided, you know. There has to be a balance. And when he comes in to the shop, he sees that it's just chill. Like, they're looking over their MIT results.
They're
and
living their lives, yeah.
And
just as if
the boss is nice to MJ instead, right?
Yeah.
And so there's this sense of harmony here where without him there, it seems like they're just living a normal
and he
life.
takes that step in appreciating that happiness despite the fact that he can't join in with them on it.
Now MJ has a necklace that she was wearing at the beginning of this movie as well.
Gosh, I
and
forgot
it's a
about
little
that.
broken necklace, right? And when we see her in this ending scene, she's still wearing that necklace. And he asks her about the necklace in this scene. He says, "Oh, I like your necklace," or something along those lines. She's like, "Oh yeah, it just appealed to me," or something like that, right? But so we see that she doesn't know why she likes the necklace, because she got it from Peter, right? And it's broken, and she likes it even though it's broken, right? And then he sees the Band-Aid on her head, and then he puts it together, and he says, "She's good, and she's self-sacrificing enough that it would be a detriment to her to continue to know me."
Yeah.
And we see that he's matured, and he actually is the older Peter that they imagined him to be, separate from them and a different kind of person now, because Paradise Lost, right? Because now he has individuated in a sense, or taken a step in individuation, and is no longer able to connect with them.
And so he moves to his own apartment.
Rent's due on the 1st, right? We see one of my favorite little symbolic moments of this movie. We see his apartment, and that he's been sewing his own
makes
new
his
suit.
new suit,
Right.
yeah.
He's finally built the suit for himself now.
Not one that's cleaned by his mother, not one that was given to him by his father, but one that he made himself.
Right. And it's I think it really ties a nice bow up at the end that we see that, and now it's Christmas time and it's cold out, right?
It's rebirth time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's the solstice, right?
It's time
And-
for the spirit of the hero to be reborn, and that's what happens.
And so yeah,
And so
he's
Spider-Man
alone
is
in the
reborn,
winter.
and this is the best reboot you could possibly do.
Yeah. That is why this worked so well for audiences, whereas The Matrix did not.
Yes.
Because this honored the spirit of not only its own sequential movies,
Not only did it honor it, but it redeemed it.
but it went further to redeem the father, right? It acted out what is good to do, which is it went back into the past and redeemed the good aspects of the ancestor of
It
this
didn't
movie.
spit on them like The Last Jedi.
Right.
It just it redeemed them. It did the opposite.
So in a meta sense, in a mimetic sense, it was good, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's why everyone is so willing to overlook the weird plot contrivances and like the weird loopholes in logic and the what people are considering to be like a character assassination for Strange, which, I mean, he's blind. Like, he's way too arrogant still, and he's always acted in arrogance, so I don't think it's that much of a stretch for him to do something like this. And also to not heed the voice, right, of what assists him.
Mm-hmm.
Right, which is Wong telling him you
Wong-O.
shouldn't do it,
Yeah.
right? So I don't really hate that as much. Like, it really does feel more coherent in that sense. And one of the best things to come out of this, I think, hopefully, is that we have a movie from Sam Raimi now directing the fallout of this for Doctor Strange.
For
So
Madness Universe, yeah. The last thing we have here in the notes is the mid-credit scene with Eddie Brock,
right,
and it says his symbiote companion Venom, which is canon towards the movies, right?
there's absolutely no reason that he should be here, right? Logically speaking, like what in the world is Venom
I haven't
doing
seen
here?
Let There Be Carnage. Maybe he knows about Spider-Man from that.
I
don't
heard
know.
something about how Venom has awareness of the multiverse or something, like he's a trans multiversal entity or
be.
something.
See, the thing is, but in Venom's original story, he only became Venom when the symbiote from Black Suit Spider-Man from Secret Wars and Eddie Brock combined, right? It was their combination that made a new entity, Venom. And I don't you said you don't know much about Spider-Man lore,
Nope.
but Venom speaks in the second what do I want to say? Third, I guess it's third person plural. Like he says
Right.
we.
Yeah.
Yeah. He says we are Venom to you, Spider-Man, right? Which is different from Carnage, who adopts I. He's fully integrated with his symbiote. But that's a different analysis. I just wanted to mention
Interesting.
that.
Yeah. I would be excited to talk about that because
his companion, like his symbiote companion Venom, and that's kind of, I don't know, the reason it's whatever. I don't want to get into Venom too much. But they're sitting at the bar talking about
basically,
the
yeah,
Avengers.
The point being that, you know, Eddie Brock's there. He's talking to someone about Thanos. He learns about Thanos. He disagrees about the nature of aliens and what aliens do, which might be a little bit telling as to what Eddie Brock represents, but I wouldn't be able to analyze that. And then he gets warped away, presumably because the spell was undone and everyone was sent back.
But
and there's a
some of
little
the
black symbiote,
is still around,
which insinuates that maybe we'll get some kind of black suit Spider-Man stuff to follow this up.
Would be great because it's the next thing.
Because this is really Spider-Man now.
Yeah.
Right? Because he has accepted the responsibility equivalent to the power that he has, and he has devoted himself to the highest possible good. The only thing for us to do after that is to start expanding on what that would mean if you were able to do that. And so I think that's kind of going to be what Venom's territory is going to touch on, right?
Well,
and
we'll just have to
those
see,
higher level responsibilities.
Well, we'll have to see. We'll get there at that point. But I think this is a good place to wrap up. We've almost been going for 3 hours now.
I know. I did not expect more than an hour and a half on this one.
Oh, no. Definitely. I knew it was going to be a while. So anything else to say?
No. I just I hope you enjoyed it. We have episodes Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursdays on YouTube where we release Get the Mic regularly. Right now, we're doing an analysis of Dragon Ball episode by episode. We're trying to do a similar type of dissection and take all of the source material seriously and see if we can extract the deeper mythological meaning behind that story. So if you enjoyed this, feel free to check that out. We would love to have you guys be part of that conversation and to leave us some comments or tune in whenever we go live about that as well. We also are on Rumble, so you can look us up there.
Give us a jumble.
Give us a grumble. If you don't like this video on YouTube, you'll have to give us a grumble in the comments because no dislikes.
Nope, no dislikes. But if you disagreed with anything, let us know. I mean,
absolutely.
If you agreed, let us know in the comments. We hope you guys enjoyed the first Myth and Movies. I think that's pretty much it, right?
Yeah, no idea what the next Myth and Movies is going to be or when it's going to be, but I
really
really enjoyed
do
it.
one a month.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I think it should be a pretty common occurrence.
Yeah, at least once a month, maybe one every 2 weeks.
But anyway, I've been your host, Brock.
On the right. I've been your host on the left, Al.
I've been on your left.
I've been on your left, boys. All right. And I think that's about all. We hope you guys have a good night.
There lived an old master named Gohan, who found a baby boy abandoned in the wilderness of the region. The old master raised the boy as his own child, and marveled as the youngster grew and became uncommonly strong. Now the boy, known as Goku, is on his own and has become the sole guardian of his grandfather's most mystical possession, his Dragon Ball.